By the end of the last ice age, northern Japan had already become home to communities adapted to one of the most resource-rich but demanding environments in East Asia. From the late Pleistocene onward, the northern arc of the Japanese archipelago formed a distinct ecological zone. Hokkaido, southern Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands lay at the intersection of subarctic forests, cold current coastlines, and river systems rich in anadromous fish. During glacial periods, lower sea levels altered these coastlines significantly, exposing land bridges and widening continental shelves. Records indicate that between 20,000 and 15,000 BCE, the region supported a mosaic of habitats: boreal woods inland, extensive wetlands in low-lying basins, and productive marine areas along the Pacific and Okhotsk coasts. This ecological diversity created multiple resource niches that early human groups could exploit. Archaeological excavations across Hokkaido reveal consistent evidence of human presence during this period. Microblade technology, a hallmark of the late Pleistocene in Northeast Asia, appears at numerous sites such as Shirataki, a major obsidian source in eastern Hokkaido. Archaeologists uncovered quarry pits and manufacturing debris indicating systematic tool production and wide-ranging procurement networks. The presence of Shirataki obsidian in sites hundreds of kilometers away suggests that these early groups were highly mobile, maintaining seasonal routes that connected interior hunting grounds with coastal areas. This mobility reflects an adaptive strategy commonly observed in cold climate foraging societies, where resource availability fluctuates sharply across seasons. Along the coasts, shell middens dating to the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene documents sustained exploitation of marine resources. These deposits, found at locations such as the Tokoro region, contain remains of shellfish, fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. Their stratigraphy indicates repeated occupation over centuries, demonstrating that some groups returned annually to the same productive zones. This pattern provides an early indication of regional population stability, showing how environmental richness could support long-term settlement even before the establishment of fully sedentary communities. As global temperatures rose after 10,000 BCE, northern Japan experienced a gradual transition from a glacial to a warmer and more humid Holocene climate. Palynological studies, analyses of preserved pollen, record a shift from open steppe and sparse conifer stands to dense mixed forests dominated by oak, birch, and spruce. This environmental transformation expanded the availability of plant foods and altered the distribution of game animals such as deer, wild boar, and brown bear. One interpretive insight that emerges from this shift is the increasing viability of semi-sedentary lifeways. As ecological productivity increased, groups no longer needed to maintain extreme mobility to sustain themselves. The rising Holocene seas reshaped coastlines, drowning river valleys and forming new bays and estuaries. Many of these environments, including the Ishikari lowlands, became highly favorable for fishing and gathering. Archaeological evidence from early Holocene settlements shows intensified use of riverine species such as salmon. Radiocarbon-dated fishing implements, including barbed points and net sinkers, point to organized seasonal harvests. This reliance on salmon would later become a defining characteristic of northern subsistence systems, linking Pleistocene foragers with the long-term patterns observed in later Jōmon and Ainu societies. The continuity of tool industries across this boundary further illustrates long-term stability. While microblade assemblages gradually declined during the early Holocene, new technologies such as ground stone axes and polishing techniques appear, reflecting adaptation to forested environments. This transition marks a second analytical insight. Technological change in the region followed environmental transformation rather than outside cultural influence. The archaeological record suggests internal development driven by ecological conditions, underscoring the autonomy of northern populations during this crucial period. Evidence from residential features provides additional details about settlement patterns. Excavations at sites such as Taisho 3 reveal shallow pit structures associated with early Holocene occupations. These features indicate repeated seasonal use rather than permanent residence but nonetheless demonstrate increasing investment in specific localities. Researchers argue that such structures represent the early stages of logistical mobility, a strategy in which base camps anchor broader subsistence activities across the landscape. This organizational pattern would persist long into the Jōmon-era, forming part of the cultural foundation inherited by later populations. The distribution of early Holocene sites also suggests expanding territorial familiarity. Concentrations around river mouths, lake basins, and obsidian sources show how communities organized movement around predictable resource zones. According to lithic sourcing studies, groups transported materials across distances that imply regular intergroup contact, whether through exchange, seasonal aggregation, or shared access rights. This provides a third analytical insight. The roots of later regional identities, including the cultural zones associated with Ainu ancestors, may lie in these early networks of movement and resource sharing, rather than in abrupt migrations or external arrivals. Marine adaptation strengthened during the Holocene climatic optimum between 6000 and 4000 BCE. Rising productivity in coastal waters supported growing populations, and the archaeological visibility of settlements increases accordingly. Middens expand in size, toolkits diversify, and food remains exhibit strong seasonality, particularly in salmon-rich river systems. These developments point to a subsistence regime that integrated inland and coastal resources in a balanced way. Such versatility would prove crucial for long-term cultural continuity in a region prone to climatic variation, volcanic activity, and shifting coastlines. By the late early Holocene, the northern archipelago was home to communities thoroughly adapted to its demanding but productive environment. Their settlements, technologies, and mobility strategies demonstrate both stability and gradual innovation. Archaeological sequences establish clear continuity between these early groups and the populations that would define the Jōmon period. These deep-time developments provide the environmental and cultural framework from which later traditions, eventually identifiable with Ainu ethnogenesis, would emerge. As early populations stabilized, they entered the Jōmon-era, a period foundational to the future Ainu cultural landscape. In northern Japan, the Jōmon established a cultural framework that would persist long after agriculture reshaped the rest of East Asia. The Jōmon period, spanning from roughly 14,000 to 300 BCE, represents one of the longest continuous foraging traditions in world archaeology. In northern Japan, and especially Hokkaido, the Jōmon developed cultural practices and subsistence systems uniquely adapted to the region's forests, river networks, and coastal environments. While mainland East Asia transitioned toward intensive agriculture during the Neolithic, Hokkaido's Jōmon communities maintained a forager-fisher-hunter economy that emphasized stability over transformation. The archaeological record illustrates a robust cultural system rooted in ecological knowledge and long-term continuity. One of the defining markers of Jōmon culture is cord-marked pottery. The earliest examples, appearing around 14,000 BCE, demonstrate considerable skill in shaping and firing clay vessels. Northern Jōmon pottery assemblages include deep pots for boiling fish and shellfish, wide-mouthed vessels for processing nuts, and specialized containers likely used for storage. Radiocarbon dates from sites such as the Taisho 3-shell midden confirm that pottery remained a consistent component of northern lifeways for thousands of years. This stability supports the interpretive insight that technological continuity, rather than rapid innovation, characterized the region's long-term development. Housing structures provide further evidence of persistence. Excavations at sites across Hokkaido, including the Minami USU and Chitose River Basin sites, reveal pit dwellings arranged in small clusters. These semi-subterranean structures featured central hearths, post holes for roof supports, and sometimes stone arrangements that indicate long-term reuse. Their gradual evolution across the Jōmon sequence suggests a cultural preference for stable, seasonally recurring settlements rather than the highly mobile patterns seen in earlier Pleistocene groups. Archaeologists argue that this settlement system reflects an equilibrium between mobility and permanence, made possible by predictable resource cycles in northern environments. Subsistence patterns in Hokkaido during the Jōmon period demonstrate a strong reliance on salmon, marine mammals, and forest resources. Zooarchaeological analyses of faunal remains from the Tokoro coast reveal dense concentrations of salmon bones, indicating organized harvests during annual runs. These resources provided a reliable caloric foundation, allowing communities to occupy riverside settlements for extended periods. Coastal sites show evidence of seal hunting, sea lion processing, and the capture of smaller marine species. Inland, deciduous forests supplied nuts such as acorns and chestnuts, which were leached and stored in quantities large enough to sustain winter populations. Plant exploitation was sophisticated but did not evolve into full agricultural production. While there is evidence of limited cultivation of species like millet in southern Jōmon territories, Hokkaido Jōmon communities did not adopt systematic agriculture. This pattern illustrates a significant interpretive insight. Environmental abundance reduced the necessity for farming, allowing foraging systems to remain viable even during periods when neighboring regions transformed economically. The stability of northern ecosystems, combined with specialized techniques for processing nuts and fish, sustained substantial populations without the pressures that drove agricultural expansion elsewhere. Lacquered objects form another hallmark of Jōmon craftsmanship. Northern sites have yielded finely worked red lacquer ornaments, combs, and ritual items. These objects demonstrate familiarity with sap extraction and multi-stage production processes, requiring repeated applications and careful drying. The presence of lacquer where across Hokkaido suggests shared aesthetic and symbolic traditions maintained over generations. Their durability within the archaeological record contributes to the broader understanding of Jōmon cultural cohesion. Trade networks during this period extend the picture of continuity and structured interaction. Jade artifacts originating from Itoigawa in central Honshu appear in northern Jōmon contexts despite being located hundreds of kilometers away. Similarly, obsidian from the Shirataki source in eastern Hokkaido has been discovered in Honshu sites, demonstrating bidirectional movement of materials. These exchanges imply sustained interregional contacts, possibly through periodic gatherings or long-distance cooperative relationships. The movement of prestige goods provides another interpretive insight. While economically autonomous, northern Jōmon communities remained integrated within broader exchange spheres of prehistoric Japan. Burial practices also contribute to our understanding of cultural continuity. Jōmon graves in Hokkaido include extended and flexed burials, occasionally accompanied by stone tools, ornaments, or pottery. Some sites feature multiple interments within the same dwelling area, suggesting long-term occupancy by related groups. Cranial and dental morphology from these remains has been extensively studied. Comparative anthropological analyses show close affinities between Jōmon populations and the later Ainu, particularly in non-metric traits such as dental shoveling patterns and specific cranial indices. These physical continuities align with genetic research indicating that mitochondrial DNA haplogroups common in the Ainu today, such as N9b and M7a, trace to Jōmon maternal lineages. Recent genome-wide studies reinforce this link. Ancient DNA extracted from Jōmon remains reveals a genetic profile distinct from later agricultural populations that entered Japan during the Yayoi period. This distinctiveness is strongly represented in modern Ainu populations, confirming long-term lineage continuity. The genetic evidence supports the academic consensus that the Ainu are not a recent formation but reflect a deep-time cultural and biological heritage stretching back into the early Holocene. Material culture parallels further strengthen this continuity. Fishing implements, bone tools, and certain decorative motifs found in late Jōmon contexts persist, with modifications, into the archaeological record of later Hokkaido cultures, such as the Api Jōmon and Okhotsk. Some of these motifs, including concentric circles, spirals, and naturalistic representations, appear in later Ainu wooden carvings and ritual objects. These parallels do not indicate direct identity but provide evidence that cultural transmission occurred across many centuries. The Northern Jōmon experience illustrates how stability can define cultural development as effectively as transformation. While agricultural societies in mainland Asia and southern Japan underwent significant demographic and technological shifts, the Northern Jōmon maintained their forager-fisher economic base through careful environmental management and long-term adaptation. Archaeological evidence from settlement patterns, technologies, and trade underscores a cultural system resilient to external change. In this continuity lies one of the foundational elements of Ainu ethnogenesis, a cultural and genetic inheritance embedded in millennia of northern adaptation. By the final centuries of the Jōmon period, Hokkaido-esque communities retained their distinct traditions, even as neighboring regions underwent major demographic shifts. This enduring stability sets the stage for the next major phase in northern Japan's cultural history. While Jōmon traditions remained strong in Hokkaido, new populations from the north would soon reshape the region's cultural dynamics. Connections with the northern world began earlier than once believed, introducing new technologies and lifeways to Jōmon-descended communities. During the late Jōmon and the transition into the early Iron Age, northern Japan entered a period of increasing external contact. Archaeological evidence indicates that populations along the Sea of Okhotsk and the northern Pacific Rim were not isolated. Instead, they participated in intermittent movements of technology, subsistence practices, and possibly small groups of people. These early influences predate the fully developed Okhotsk culture yet demonstrate a clear pattern. Northern Hokkaido had begun to interact with the wider circumpolar world. This context marks the beginning of cultural layering that would eventually shape Ainu ethnogenesis. Evidence for these early interactions appears most clearly in coastal regions facing the Soya Strait and the Kuril Islands. Excavations at the Ribun and Rishiri Island sites reveal tool types not typical of local Jōmon sequences. These include toggling harpoons, barbed bone points, and specialized fishing gear more commonly associated with maritime groups of the Okhotsk Sea region. Radiocarbon dates from these assemblages cluster around the first millennium BCE, suggesting that long-distance movements of technology were already underway. The presence of these implements demonstrates an interpretive insight central to understanding northern prehistory. Maritime cultures in the Okhotsk Basin formed a continuous interaction zone rather than isolated local traditions. Domesticated dog remains reinforce this picture of early contact. At several coastal Jōmon and Epi-Jōmon sites, particularly in northeastern Hokkaido, researchers identified dog burials with traits resembling breeds found across the wider circumpolar north. Stable isotope analysis indicates that some of these animals were provisioned primarily with marine foods, suggesting use in seal and sea lion hunting. Comparable practices are documented among later Okhotsk communities and among modern coastal groups in the northern Pacific. Their presence in Jōmon-descended contexts implies the diffusion of hunting techniques and the selective adoption of northern practices well before the Okhotsk expansion reached its height. Material parallels extend beyond hunting technologies. Bone needles, composite fishhooks, and certain forms of slate tools found along the eastern Hokkaido coast show similarities to early assemblages from Sakhalin and the lower Amur region. Archaeologists argue that these objects reflect both direct and indirect contacts facilitated by seasonal mobility. Although large-scale migration has not been firmly demonstrated for this period, the distribution of artifacts indicates knowledge transfer across maritime corridors. This constitutes a second key interpretive insight. Technological exchange does not require major demographic movement, and small-scale interactions can produce profound cultural effects over time. Geographic factors played a decisive role in enabling these early connections. The Soya Strait, separating Hokkaido from Sakhalin, is narrow and seasonally navigable. During the late Jōmon, lower sea levels and the region's strong currents likely facilitated drift voyages. The Kuril chain offered another series of stepping stone islands linking Hokkaido to the Kamchatka Peninsula and the broader North Pacific. Ethno-historical analogies from later periods demonstrate that small boats could travel through this archipelago following marine mammal migration routes and predictable weather patterns. Such environmental conditions support the view that repeated contact would have been both feasible and advantageous for coastal groups. These interactions gradually introduced new subsistence strategies into Jōmon-descended communities. Increased reliance on sea mammals, particularly seals, appears in zooarchaeological records from eastern Hokkaido. At the Moyoro Shell Midden and related early sites, faunal compositions shift toward species common in the Sea of Okhotsk. Although these assemblages belong to later phases, their early precursors show a similar, though less intensive, pattern. This evolution demonstrates an incremental shift toward maritime specialization, likely influenced by northerly contacts. Such changes offer a third interpretive insight. Cultural transformation in northern Japan resulted not from abrupt replacement but from a long-term process of selective adaptation in response to shifting external influences. The concept of cultural layering helps explain this developmental trajectory. Late Jōmon populations maintained their foundational practices, pit dwellings, cord-marked pottery, and diverse foraging strategies, yet integrated new tools and subsistence techniques as opportunities arose. This produced a cultural landscape in which no single influence dominated. Instead, multiple traditions overlapped, interacted, and gradually merged. Later Ainu culture would inherit elements from several of these layers. The deep-time Jōmon base, the maritime adaptations associated with northern contacts, and the subsequent contributions of Okhotsk and Satsuma groups. Human mobility forms another component of this process. Although large-scale migration into Hokkaido during this transitional period remains unproven, the presence of non-local materials indicates at least some movement of individuals or small groups. Obsidian trace analysis shows that stones originating from Sakhalin appear in northern Jōmon contexts. Conversely, Jōmon decorative styles occasionally appear in early northern sites, suggesting bidirectional influence. Such patterns reinforce the view that the Sea of Okhotsk region functioned as a connected maritime world, with Hokkaido positioned as a southern anchor within this network. These early contacts also set the stage for demographic developments that would intensify in subsequent centuries. By the start of the first millennium CE, the archaeological record begins to show clear distinctions between Jōmon-descended populations and the groups that would later play a major role in northern Japan's cultural evolution. The uneven distribution of tools and faunal remains suggests increasing regional differentiation, possibly reflecting specialized communities oriented toward either coastal or riverine subsistence. These trends foreshadow the more pronounced cultural boundaries that would emerge with the arrival of the fully developed Okhotsk culture. As these early influences accumulated, they created a dynamic environment in which ethnogenesis became possible. The Ainu would ultimately emerge from the interaction of multiple populations, lifeways, and technological traditions. The initial stages of that process began during this transitional period, when new northern elements entered the long-standing Jōmon world and reshaped it in subtle but enduring ways. These early interactions would intensify dramatically with the rise of the Okhotsk culture. By the 5th century CE, a new maritime society appeared unexpectedly on Hokkaido's eastern shores. The Okhotsk culture, active from roughly 500 to 1000 CE, represented one of the most influential external populations to enter northern Japan during the first millennium. Archaeological consensus places their origins in the lower Amur Basin and northern Sakhalin, regions where similar material traditions, particularly in bone tools and ceramic forms, existed several centuries earlier. As they expanded southward along the Sea of Okhotsk rim, they brought with them a highly specialized maritime economy and cultural system distinct from the forager-fisher traditions inherited from the Jōmon. Their arrival on the coasts of Hokkaido marked the beginning of a new cultural layer in the region's long and complex ethnogenetic sequence. Okhotsk settlements in Hokkaido are most commonly found on the northeastern and eastern coasts, with major concentrations in the Tokoro Plain. Sites such as Moyoro, Hamanaka, and Ufutsu reveal a settlement structure oriented toward predictable access to marine mammals. Excavations show semi-subterranean dwellings arranged in shoreline clusters, often associated with processing areas containing large accumulations of seal, sea lion, and sea otter remains. Radiocarbon dates from these sites align with the mid-1st millennium CE, demonstrating the rapid establishment of stable coastal communities shortly after the culture's movement into Hokkaido. Subsistence patterns form one of the clearest markers of the Okhotsk presence. Zooarchaeological analyses consistently highlight an economy centered on marine mammals, supplemented by fish, shellfish, and limited terrestrial hunting. Stable isotope studies conducted on human remains from Moyoro and other sites provide strong evidence for a protein-heavy diet derived overwhelmingly from marine sources. The ratio of nitrogen and carbon isotopes indicates a dietary pattern far more marine-oriented than any preceding Jōmon or contemporary Satsuma groups. This data supports the first interpretive insight. The Okhotsk were not simply coastal foragers, but represented a specialized maritime adaptation developed over generations in the northern Pacific. Characteristic artifacts further define this culture. Distinctive bone tools, including harpoon heads, toggling points, fish spears, and composite hooks, illustrate a hunting system specifically adapted for seal and sea lion procurement. Ceramic assemblages include thick-walled pots with rolled rims and complex stamped designs. Their pottery shows closer similarities to Amur region ceramics than to earlier Hokkaido traditions, reinforcing evidence of northern origins. Iron tools, knives, spearheads, and fishing equipment appear regularly, suggesting active participation in interregional exchange with Far Eastern mainland communities. These tools point to a second interpretive insight. The Okhotsk were embedded within broader networks linking the Amur, Sakhalin, and Kuril regions, making Hokkaido one node in a far-reaching maritime world. Ritual and symbolic artifacts add another dimension to their cultural identity. Bear-shaped earrings, small figurines, and decorated bone implements frequently appear in Okhotsk contexts. These objects are often interpreted as having links to bear ceremonialism, a tradition known historically among the Ainu and reflected in later ethnographic accounts. While direct continuity remains debated, the prevalence of bear symbolism in Okhotsk ritual objects suggests at minimum a shared northern circumpolar cultural foundation. Archaeologists view this as an important interpretive insight. Aspects of symbolic life in northern Japan had connections to a wider cultural sphere stretching across the Amur, Sakhalin, and Okhotsk sea regions. Settlement organization demonstrates consistent patterns across excavated sites. Houses were semi-subterranean, with central hearths and well-defined perimeters lined with stones or wooden posts. Many sites include multiple structures, processing pits, and storage areas, suggesting extended occupation rather than seasonal use. The placement of dwellings near river mouths and sheltered bays indicates careful selection for access to both marine mammals and migratory fish such as salmon. At Tokoro, the density of dwellings suggests a long-established settlement with considerable population stability. These patterns indicate a community deeply committed to a coastal lifestyle and capable of sustaining relatively large populations by exploiting predictable marine resources. Trade and exchange form another prominent feature of Okhotsk cultural life. Amur region pottery, mainland-style metal goods, and non-local stone materials appear in several Hokkaido Okhotsk sites. Conversely, some objects indicative of Hokkaido origins, including particular styles of fish hooks and small decorations, appear in northern Sakhalin contexts, implying bidirectional exchange. The distribution of these materials across the Sea of Okhotsk supports the conclusion that the Okhotsk maritime network functioned as a structured, multidirectional system rather than a simple expansion. Their involvement in long-distance trade helps explain the presence of iron tools in regions without local production and demonstrates the integration of Hokkaido into broader northern economic circuits. Social organization within Okhotsk communities can be partially inferred from their burial practices. Many sites contain extended burials with grave goods, such as decorated bone tools, ceramics, and ornaments. The inclusion of specific animal remains, especially bears and canids, points to a ritualized relationship with certain species. The presence of grave goods with children, as well as adults, suggests inherited social status may have played a role in their society. Although the full social structure remains uncertain, the burial evidence supports the view that Okhotsk communities exhibited internal differentiation and possibly clan-based identities. With the arrival of the Okhotsk in Hokkaido, the cultural landscape became increasingly diverse. Their specialized maritime adaptation contrasted sharply with inland forager groups and with communities that would soon develop into the Satsuman culture. This juxtaposition created a mosaic of lifeways within the region, setting the stage for later interactions that would contribute to Ainu ethnogenesis. The distinctiveness of Okhotsk material culture, combined with archaeological visibility, makes them one of the most identifiable external influences in early medieval Hokkaido. By the late first millennium, Okhotsk settlements reached their peak distribution along Hokkaido's eastern coastline. Their presence marked a period of unprecedented contact between Hokkaido and the northern mainland, creating new cultural and economic connections that transformed local communities. Yet their influence was not uniform across the island, and contrasting cultural developments inland would come to define another vital layer in the region's ethnogenetic process. While Okkotsk communities thrived along the coasts, inland groups were developing a different cultural trajectory. While the Okkotsk mastered the northern seas, the Satsuma developed inland societies rooted in long-standing Jōmon traditions. If the Okkotsk culture arrived in Hokkaido like a tide from the north, then the Satsuma culture emerged as something quieter, slower, and more deeply rooted. It represented not an intrusion from abroad, but the transformation of local Jōmon-descended communities as they adapted to new technologies, new trade networks, and the shifting political landscape of early medieval Japan. By the 8th century, the culture archaeologists call Satsuman had taken shape across much of southwestern and central Hokkaido, an inland world of villages, hearths, and carefully maintained traditions that would ultimately form the backbone of future Ainu society. The Satsuman culture, dated generally from 700 to 1200 CE, is best understood as an expression of continuity, a continuation of the late Jōmon's deep connection to land, forest, and river systems. Yet it was also a product of selective change. As new cultural influences from Honshu filtered northward, from the expansion of the Emishi regions to early contact with Wajan polities, Jōmon-descended groups encountered new materials and techniques. But rather than adopting these wholesale, they integrated them cautiously, shaping outside innovations according to long-standing local values. This dynamic is clearest in the ceramics. Satsuman pottery, while more refined than its predecessor, maintained Jōmon sensibilities. Simple jars with cord-marked surfaces, pots with rounded bases suitable for hearth cooking, and vessels used in both daily subsistence and ritual activities. Yet the clay mixtures, firing techniques, and some decorative elements hint at contact with contemporaneous Japanese groups. The result is a hybrid ceramic tradition, neither fully Jōmon nor fully mainland Japanese, that mirrors the culture's broader identity. One of the most significant transformations in Satsuman life was the introduction of limited agriculture. While Hokkaido's colder climate restricted the cultivation of many staples common in Honshu, Satsuman communities appear to have grown small amounts of barley, millet, and possibly buckwheat. Archaeobotanical remains and the presence of iron agricultural tools, sickles, spades, and knives, suggest that farming supplemented rather than replaced traditional foraging and hunting. Still, this shift was meaningful. Sedentary villages with semi-rectangular pit dwellings began to appear more frequently, along with granary-like structures and evidence of land management. The agricultural practices of the Satsuman were modest by mainland standards, but they marked a departure from the primarily hunter-gatherer lifestyle of earlier Jōmon societies. These early experiments with farming, however limited, would later influence aspects of Ainu botanical knowledge and seasonal rhythms. Iron tools likewise transformed Satsuman daily life. Imported primarily through trade with the Wajan, iron blades replaced stone in many crucial tasks, from woodworking to food processing. But even as metal tools spread, older traditions persisted. Stone arrowheads, bone hooks, and antler implements remained in use, showing that the Satsuman technological system was pluralistic rather than uniform. The goal was utility, not cultural replacement. Archaeological surveys show that the Satsuman lived predominantly inland, along river valleys and forest edges where resources were abundant year-round. Villages range from small clusters of houses to more substantial communities of dozens of buildings. Hearth-centered dwellings, storage pits, and communal outdoor spaces suggest a lifestyle built around cooperation and seasonal gathering. The spatial distribution of Satsuman sites contrasts sharply with that of the maritime Okkotsk. While Okkotsk settlements favored coastal promontories, inlets, and shores rich in marine mammals, the Satsuman turned toward riverine and forest environments. Fishing weirs, pit traps, and evidence of deer and bear hunting are widespread. These inland patterns reflect a Jōmon-derived worldview in which forests and rivers were spiritual as well as economic centers. Burial practices reinforce the sense of continuity. Many Satsuman graves resemble earlier Jōmon traditions, with simple pits and limited grave goods. Ritual objects, bear skulls, carved objects, or ceremonial tools occasionally appear, hinting at belief systems that would later develop more fully in Ainu spirituality, particularly the reverence for animal kamui. Perhaps the most important feature of the Satsuman culture is its refusal to assimilate fully into the world of the Japanese mainland. Despite increasing contact with Waijin communities through trade, migration, or political encounters, the Satsuman retained a distinctly northern identity. This is evident not only in their pottery and tools, but also in their settlement choices, foodways, and ritual practices. Comparisons with Nara and Heian period cultures in Honshu show that the Satsuman adopted only what fit their existing system. For example, while mainland groups practiced irrigated rice agriculture, the Satsuman did not. Instead, they incorporated small-scale dry field techniques compatible with Hokkaido's ecology. Iron tools and ornaments arrived, but the symbolic systems that accompanied them, such as elite burial displays, hierarchical status markers, and writing, did not take root. This resistance to cultural absorption reflects a recurring theme in Hokkaido's history: autonomy. While political entities on Honshu grew increasingly centralized under imperial authority, Hokkaido remained a mosaic of decentralized, mobile, and flexible communities. Satsuman cultural independence laid a foundation for the later emergence of the Ainu as a distinct people, shaped not by isolation but by a deliberate balance of tradition and adaptation. The Satsuman world was not isolated. Trade networks linked Hokkaido's interior to the Sea of Japan, the Kuril Islands, and even the Amur Basin. Yet these connections did not erase cultural boundaries. Inland groups interacted with Okkotsk communities along the coasts, sometimes exchanging goods and technologies, sometimes competing for territory or resources. These interactions created zones of cultural contact, regions where ceramics mingle, tools overlap, and genetic evidence shows limited but meaningful mixing. In these contact regions, the seeds of Ainu ethnogenesis were already visible. Communities blending the inland traditions of the Satsuman with the maritime specializations of the Okkotsk. The merging of these two traditions, maritime Okkotsk and inland Satsuman, set the stage for Ainu ethnogenesis. Between the 8th and 12th centuries, new cultural identities emerged from the meeting of inland farmers and coastal hunters. What followed in Hokkaido during these centuries was not a sudden break with the past, nor the arrival of a single new people, but the slow weaving of two cultural threads, Satsuman and Okkotsk, into something recognizably new. Archaeologists, geneticists, and linguists now agree that Ainu culture did not emerge from isolation. It emerged from interaction. Inland communities rooted in Jōmon persistence met coastal groups shaped by the northern maritime world, and over generations their practices, beliefs, and ways of living began to blend. By the end of the High Middle Ages, a distinct cultural identity, Ainu, occupied a wide arc of northern East Asia. The mechanism of this transformation was complex, but its outline is visible in the material record. Beginning around the 8th century, Satsuman villages expanded toward the eastern coasts, while Okkotsk settlements pushed inland along river mouths and estuaries. These were places of resource overlap: salmon-rich waterways, hunting grounds shared by deer and bear, and trade corridors that connected Hokkaido to Sakhalin, the Kurils, and beyond. In these border areas, ceramics appear with mixed stylistic signatures, combining Satsuman clay tempering techniques with Okkotsk decorative motifs. Hearth layouts, house shapes, and tool assemblages likewise show a blending that suggests ongoing contact rather than isolated episodes of migration. Biological evidence aligns with this archaeological picture. Genetic studies of ancient remains, from both Satsuman and Okkotsk-associated burials, indicate limited but significant admixture. People in these interacting zones carried ancestries linked to the indigenous Jōmon substrate and to groups related to the Tungusic-speaking populations around the lower Amur. The Ainu of the early modern period inherited this dual legacy, a majority Jōmon-derived lineage enriched through northern coastal connections. This genetic mixture was not uniform. It unfolded gradually and regionally, producing the mosaic pattern seen across Hokkaido, southern Sakhalin, and the Kuril chain. Cultural blending is clearest in ritual life. Both Satsuma and Okkotsk communities practiced bear ceremonialism, though in different forms. Among Okkotsk groups, the bear held a central place in seasonal rites linked to coastal hunting cycles. In Satsuman tradition, partly inherited from the Jōmon, the bear was a powerful being of the mountains and forests, representing danger, sustenance, and spirit. When these populations interacted, their ritual worlds intertwined. Archaeological sites from the blended zones show bear skulls arranged with a care resembling later Ainu ceremonial patterns. Elements of Okkotsk coastal ideology merged with Satsuman forest spirituality, producing the distinctive Ainu Ayamat, the sending back ceremony in which the spirit of the bear, treated as a visiting divinity, is respectfully released to the realm of the Kamui. This same pattern of synthesis appears in subsistence practices. The Okkotsk were master maritime hunters. They hunted seals, sea lions, and cetaceans using advanced harpoons, bone tools, and watercraft suited to the harsh northern seas. They fished year-round and maintained robust trade networks with Sakhalin and the Amur Basin. The Satsuman, by contrast, relied primarily on inland resources, salmon runs, deer hunting, nuts, and small-scale agriculture. The earliest Ainu communities inherited both systems. They became expert fishers, building weirs along major rivers, but they also maintained hunting traditions deeply tied to seasonal forest cycles. Their economy balanced the inland focus of the Satsuman with the maritime reach of the Okkotsk, creating a flexible subsistence strategy capable of sustaining communities across varied environments. Material culture from this era further illustrates the emergence of Ainu identity. One of the clearest markers is the appearance of spiral-patterned earrings, ornaments with roots in Okkotsk symbolic design but gradually reworked into a distinct style. These spirals would later evolve into recognizable Ainu motifs found in textiles, carvings, and ceremonial tools. Even more revealing is the development of the ikupasui, the carved prayer stick used by Ainu men during ritual libations. Its form does not correspond perfectly to either Satsuman or Okkotsk prototypes. Instead, it appears as a new cultural creation forged out of shared practices. The Satsuman tradition of wooden ritual implements blended with the Okkotsk emphasis on carved bone and symbolic patterning. By the 11th or 12th century, the ikupasui had become central to Ainu ceremonial life, embodying both inherited and newly formed ideas about communication with the spirit world. Trade further accelerated cultural convergence. Satsuman communities were already engaged with Weijin merchants and frontier polities in northern Honshu, exchanging furs, marine products, and crafted goods. Okkotsk groups maintained routes northward and westward, linking Hokkaido to Sakhalin, the lower Amur, and indirectly to the networks of Northeast Asia. When these trading spheres overlapped, an economic foundation for Ainu identity took shape. Ainu predecessors developed an intermediary role, connecting the forest products of the interior to the sea mammal harvests of the Okkotsk coast and later to Weijin traders seeking northern resources. This commercial positioning helped solidify cultural coherence. Shared exchange practices, shared obligations, and shared ritualized hospitality norms reinforced the sense of belonging to a single world. Linguistic evidence paints a more enigmatic picture. Ainu is a language isolate, unrelated to Japanese, Tungusic, or any other known family. Most scholars believe its deep roots stretch back into the Jōmon period, making it one of the oldest continuous linguistic lineages in Northeast Asia. Yet the linguistic isolation of Ainu does not preclude contact. Borrowed vocabulary from Nifk, from early Japanese, and possibly from extinct Northeast Asian languages indicates that early Ainu communities were culturally porous even as they maintained a distinct tongue. The persistence of this language through centuries of contact suggests strong internal cohesion, an identity sturdy enough to incorporate outside influences without losing its core. By around the 12th century, the cultural formation recognizable as Ainu had emerged fully. Their territory stretched across nearly all of Hokkaido, extended into southern Sakhalin, and reached along the Kuril Islands. Coastal groups specialized in sea mammal hunting and long-distance trade. Inland groups focused on salmon fisheries, deer hunting, and forest gathering. Yet all shared the same spiritual worldview, the same aesthetic patterns, the same ceremonial objects, and increasingly the same social norms. This was the moment when the Ainu became more than a blend of their predecessors. They became a distinct cultural world, shaped by deep Jōmon ancestry, enriched by Okhotsk maritime traditions, and unified through new forms of ritual, economy, and identity that belonged wholly to them. Once formed, Ainu communities developed political structures and trade systems that connected them to East Asia's broader medieval world. Ainu villages developed along the region's rivers, the lifelines of subsistence and communication. Throughout the medieval period, the Khotan served as the fundamental unit of Ainu settlement. Archaeological surveys across Hokkaido and southern Sakhalin show that these villages were characteristically situated along major waterways such as the Ishikari, Tokachi, and Saru rivers, or along productive coastal inlets facing the Sea of Okhotsk or the Pacific. Rivers provided more than food. They were transportation corridors, territorial boundaries, and conduits for trade. Their annual salmon runs shaped the rhythm of subsistence, while their navigability connected villages across long distances. Settlement placement consistently reflects this priority. Nearly all excavated Khotan sites position dwellings within sight of a river bend, estuary, or coastal shelf where fishing platforms could be easily constructed. Within these settlements, household structures followed a recognizable pattern. The standard Ainu dwelling, the sais, was a rectangular building with a central hearth, constructed from locally available wood, bamboo, and reeds. Excavations reveal post holes arranged in uniform rectangular grids, showing that even earlier Ainu houses maintained this general plan. Hearths, often containing layers of ash, bone fragments, and burnt tools, serve as valuable archaeological markers, indicating long-term occupation and repeated use for cooking, heating, and ritual activities. Storerooms, often built on raised platforms, stood adjacent to dwellings and were used to protect dried fish, furs, and seasonal supplies from moisture and animals. These storage structures were essential for winter survival, especially for communities occupying inland regions where snow cover could isolate villages for weeks. Some Khotan included designated ritual spaces. Archaeological remains of fenced enclosures, together with ethnographic accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries, indicate areas used for keeping live bears destined for Ayamant ceremonies. These pens were typically located at the periphery of the settlement, separated from the central dwellings but still within communal grounds. Their presence suggests a well-organized spatial division between secular and ritual functions, reinforcing the prominence of ceremonial life in Ainu society. Adjacent zones often show concentrations of carved wooden objects and animal remains, indicating recurring ritual activity. Population size within Khotan varied widely, but most archaeological estimates place typical village populations between 30 and 100 individuals. These small, kin-based communities were structured around extended families, with several households forming loosely associated clusters. Settlement density was low compared to contemporaneous agricultural societies in mainland Japan, reflecting the Ainu reliance on hunting, fishing, and foraging rather than intensive farming. Excavated refuse deposits, composed of fish bones, shell remains, ceramics, and tool fragments, demonstrate that these communities practiced long-term but not necessarily year-round occupation of core village sites. Seasonal movement formed an integral part of Ainu settlement strategy. While winter villages were stable and substantial, summer activities required temporary camps at river mouths, along salmon streams, or in upland hunting territories. These locations are identifiable archaeologically through small-scale hearths, limited midden accumulation, and portable tool assemblages dominated by fishing gear and hunting implements. This mobility allowed communities to exploit a wide range of resources while maintaining central Khotan as anchors of social and ritual life. The pattern reflects a balanced adaptation to northern environments, stable enough to support consistent social structures, yet flexible enough to respond to seasonal ecological variation. The internal layout of Khotan also reveals important aspects of community organization. Dwellings tended to align parallel to the river, with entrances facing downstream or toward the water. This orientation facilitated quick access to fishing platforms, boats, and riverside work areas. In some sites, archaeologists have identified communal spaces associated with food preparation and craft production, suggesting shared labor practices during peak seasons such as salmon processing or hide tanning. The placement of storerooms, hearths, and refuse areas indicates a deliberate effort to manage cleanliness, food preservation, and fire safety, demonstrating practical knowledge shaped by generations of environmental experience. Taken together, these settlement patterns present a coherent picture of early Ainu life. Small, kin-based villages strategically located along vital watercourses, structured around hearth-centered dwellings, and supported by a seasonal cycle of movement and resource use. This spatial arrangement provided stability without centralization and allowed diverse communities to sustain themselves across the varied landscapes of Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kurils. These settlements supported social systems distinct from contemporary East Asian states. Ainu governance rested not on centralized authority, but on kinship networks and local leadership. Across the medieval period, political organization among Ainu communities developed through closely linked kin groups rather than formal state institutions. Each Khotan operated as an autonomous settlement governed by a hereditary leader known as the Khotan Korkor, or village master. Archaeological evidence for differential wealth, such as imported iron tools, decorated wooden artifacts, and high-status bear ceremony items, suggests that certain lineages held enduring influence within villages. However, leadership authority was relational rather than absolute. The Khotan Korkor guided negotiations, established alliances, and represented the village in disputes, but consensus among senior household heads remained central to major decisions. This decentralized system contrasts sharply with the bureaucratic structures of contemporary Heian Japan or the more hierarchical polities of Northeast Asia, demonstrating the autonomy of Ainu socio-political development. Written sources provide partial insight into these dynamics. Early Japanese accounts, including entries preserved in the Shinra no Koroku and fragments of the Nihon Shoki, describe northern peoples who conducted diplomacy, organized resistance, and traded with frontier officials. Although terminology in these texts is imprecise, later ethnographic studies help clarify that Ainu leaders mediated between communities rather than ruling them. Warfare, when it occurred, was typically small-scale and reciprocal, rooted in conflicts over fishing sites, trade grievances, or interpersonal disputes rather than territorial conquest. Chiefs acted as negotiators in these situations, employing personal authority, negotiation skill, and inherited prestige rather than codified political power. Clan structures formed the backbone of Ainu social hierarchy. Each village contained several extended families linked through bilateral kinship, enabling flexible marriage alliances across settlements. Marriage networks were crucial for maintaining peaceful relations and strengthening access to trade routes. Archaeological findings of distinct adornment styles, such as specific earring forms or carving motifs, suggest clan-level identities that persisted across generations. These groups maintained internal leadership roles, overseeing resource use, organizing hunting parties, and maintaining ritual practices. The absence of rigid class distinctions, such as those found in mainland Japanese or Manchurian societies, points to a social hierarchy defined more by lineage prestige and interpersonal reputation than institutionalized rank. Inheritance customs further illuminate the structure of authority. Leadership typically passed from father to eldest son or to a capable close relative, but succession was not automatic. Community acceptance played a decisive role. Ethnographic evidence from the 19th century, carefully applied to earlier periods, indicates that leadership candidates needed demonstrated skill in diplomacy, trade management, and ritual knowledge. Material goods associated with authority, such as decorated swords, ceremonial staffs, or lacquered containers, often accompanied the transfer of leadership. These objects, recovered archaeologically from burial contexts and preserved in later museum collections, serve as material markers of political continuity within Ainu society. Dispute resolution forms another crucial aspect of leadership. Chiefs oversaw negotiations within the village and arranged meetings with neighboring communities when conflicts threatened broader stability. The use of ritual speeches, exchange of compensation goods, and appeals to clan histories all played roles in reconciling disputes. This reliance on negotiated settlement reflects an interpretive insight. Ainu political authority functioned through social maintenance rather than territorial control. Leaders prioritized harmony between kin groups because the survival of each village depended on cooperation in resource procurement and seasonal movement. Inter-village alliances extended the influence of leading clans, especially those controlling access to key salmon rivers or trade nodes. Some regions, such as the Saru River Basin, display archaeological evidence of sustained interaction among multiple Khotan, including shared ritual sites and coordinated seasonal activities. These networks likely amplified the authority of prominent leaders, enabling them to mediate regional diplomacy, organize collective hunts, or manage trade contacts with external groups such as the Wajan or mainland merchants. Yet even in these cases, no evidence suggests the emergence of a centralized polity. Instead, authority operated through interconnected but independent leadership nodes. Social hierarchy was noticeable but limited. Certain families accumulated prestigious goods, such as mainland ceramics, iron tools, or carved ritual implements, reflecting their role as intermediaries in trade or diplomacy. Nevertheless, there is no indication of a stratified class system. Slavery, occasionally described in later sources, appears to have been minimal and situational rather than an organized institution. Differences in status were expressed through ceremonial leadership, marriage alliances, and the possession of heirloom objects, not through restrictive legal or economic structures. This pattern demonstrates the third interpretive insight. Ainu society maintained recognizable hierarchy without the rigid stratification typical of state-level societies in East Asia. The combination of kinship-based authority, flexible clan networks, and hereditary leadership created a robust yet decentralized socio-political structure. This system supported resilience across diverse regions, from Hokkaido to southern Sakhalin and the Kurils, allowing communities to remain politically autonomous while still maintaining regional cohesion. It also provided a framework for managing interactions with outside powers, enabling Ainu leaders to negotiate with Japanese officials, mainland traders, and neighboring groups throughout the medieval period. These social networks enabled the expansion of long-distance trade. Trade connected Ainu communities to a far larger world than their remote northern geography might suggest. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, Ainu communities were active participants in regional trade systems that linked northern Japan, Sakhalin, the Amur Basin, and, eventually, the Russian Far East. Archaeological evidence from coastal and riverine settlements indicates a steady flow of commodities through Ainu-controlled networks. Excavations at sites such as Menashidomari and Moyoro have revealed imported iron tools, continental-style beads, and mainland ceramics that arrived through exchange rather than local manufacture. These findings demonstrate that Ainu groups, though politically decentralized, maintained regular contact with neighboring cultures and adapted effectively to shifting trade conditions. Ainu exports were valuable and diverse. Furs from sable, fox, otter, and bear were highly prized by mainland merchants and appear frequently in records of early Japanese frontier administrations. Dried salmon, a staple of Ainu subsistence, also functioned as a major trade commodity. Its portability and long shelf life made it an efficient medium of exchange, and its movement is documented in both archaeological deposits and Japanese administrative texts. Hawk feathers, especially those of the black kite and goshawk, entered elite gift networks in mainland Japan, where they held ceremonial significance. Marine products such as seal oil, whalebone, and fish skins complemented these exports, forming a broad resource base that underpinned Ainu economic relations. Trade with Wajan, mainland Japanese, merchants became increasingly structured during the 9th to 14th centuries. The expanding influence of the Matsumi domain in later periods formalized some of these exchanges, but earlier interactions were more fluid. Japanese sources describe frontier trade posts where Ainu leaders exchanged furs and fish for iron blades, lacquerware, rice, and cloth. Archaeological finds of Sioux ware and other Japanese ceramics at inland Ainu settlements confirm the penetration of imported goods far beyond the coastal interface. These materials arrived through established Ainu trading routes, which were managed by kin-based networks rather than centralized authorities. This pattern illustrates that Ainu actors controlled significant portions of the distribution process, rather than functioning solely as passive recipients. The Ainu also maintained substantial links with northern groups across the Sea of Okhotsk. Trade with the Nifk, Uilta, and Nanai brought in iron objects, harpoons, reindeer products, and foreign-style ornaments. Excavated iron knives and bone tools found in northeast Hokkaido show clear typological affinities with Sakhalin and Lower Amur artifacts. These connections highlight an interpretive insight. Ainu trade was multidirectional, forming part of a larger circumpolar exchange zone rather than operating solely through Japanese contact. The circulation of goods across these regions enabled cultural transmission, facilitating the spread of tool types, decorative motifs, and ritual items. By the 17th century, Russian traders entered the network through Sakhalin and the Kurils. Early Cossack documents and later imperial reports mention trade in furs, fish products, and ironware with coastal Ainu groups. While detailed archaeological evidence from this period is uneven, imported Russian beads, metal goods, and ceramics in the Kuril Islands indicate that Ainu communities managed extensive north-south exchange routes. The ability of Ainu leaders to adapt to new trading partners underscores their role as intermediaries linking disparate regions of Northeast Asia. Trade had important social and political effects within Ainu society. Prestige goods circulated unevenly, reinforcing the standing of prominent clans and enhancing the authority of leaders who mediated long-distance exchanges. Control of productive salmon rivers or strategic maritime passages allowed certain villages to accumulate wealth and influence. These dynamics illustrate another interpretive insight. Ainu economic life was embedded in socio-political networks where trade supported leadership structures and facilitated inter-village cooperation. Material culture provides concrete evidence of these systems. Finds of glass beads, Chinese coins, and iron axes across Hokkaido demonstrate the wide reach of trade routes. Ceramics from mainland Japan appear frequently in ritual contexts, suggesting that imported items held symbolic as well as practical value. The distribution of foreign goods across settlements of varying size shows that even remote Khotan participated in long-distance exchange, emphasizing the integration of the entire region into broader economic systems. Despite the benefits of trade, expanding interaction also brought new pressures. As Ainu groups became increasingly connected to Wajan merchants and frontier authorities, competition over access to resources and trade profits intensified. Disputes over distribution rights, taxation demands, and control of fishing grounds gradually escalated, undermining long-standing exchange relationships. Growing trade brought increasing contact and eventual conflict with Japanese states. By the 8th century, northern Japan had become a frontier where Ainu and Wajan societies began to meet. What followed was a slow, uneven expansion of Wajan influence across northern Honshu, an era shaped as much by shifting political power in the imperial court as by the geography of the frontier itself. From the Nara through the Heian periods, the Japanese state sought to consolidate its authority over the peoples collectively labeled as Emishi. These groups were diverse, some agricultural, some semi-nomadic, some already interacting with early Ainu communities, but in the written chronicles of the time they were treated as a single frontier population resisting imperial rule. Military campaigns, diplomacy, and intermarriage gradually shifted the balance. By the 10th century, powerful regional families such as the Abe and later the Ando had emerged as intermediaries, controlling both local populations and the expanding networks of trade. As the Wajan presence stabilized in northern Honshu, maritime routes along the Tsugaru Strait gained importance. Small fleets of traders, tax collectors, and frontier officials began pushing northward, first seasonally and eventually with semi-permanent outposts. Their goal was not conquest in the early phases, but access to furs, feathers, marine products, and the northern trade links that stretched toward the Okhotsk Sea. These expeditions brought new materials into the region, suware vessels of distinctly Japanese manufacture, iron blades and tools, bronze ornaments, and occasionally Buddhist objects associated with court culture. Archaeological finds in southern Hokkaido reveal the footprint of this gradual south-to-north movement. At sites such as the Oshima Peninsula, layers of locally produced pottery sit alongside imports from Tohoku, marking points of contact where Weijin merchants and Ainu communities exchanged goods, stories, and technologies. These objects do not indicate direct colonization during this early period, but they do signal the increasing frequency of interaction. Material culture provides a clearer timeline than scattered written references, showing that Weijin influence radiated outward in pulses rather than in one continuous wave. For Ainu groups living in southern Hokkaido, these encounters introduced new opportunities and uncertainties. Iron, in particular, shifted economic calculations. Ainu hunters valued iron knives and spearheads, while Weijin traders sought the region's prized goods. The frontier thus became a zone of mutual curiosity, cautious negotiation, and emerging dependency systems, long before formal conflicts erupted. As maritime activity increased, so too did the social and economic pressure along the frontier. Buddhist artifacts found in ritual contexts hint that religious ideas traveled northward, though not necessarily as organized missionary activity. Instead, these objects likely arrived through trade and personal exchange, becoming part of the eclectic spiritual landscape of frontier communities. These early centuries form the foundation for all later Weijin-Ainu relations. Commercial partnerships, political alliances, and eventually tensions born from asymmetry. What began as sporadic contact gradually developed into structured interaction, setting the stage for more intensive exchanges during the medieval period. These interactions intensified as commerce expanded. Trade became the first structured bridge between Ainu chiefs and medieval Japanese authorities. By the 12th century, that bridge had begun to solidify into a dependable, if delicate, system of exchange linking Hokkaido to northern Honshu. For the first time, Ainu communities and Weijin authorities interacted not only through sporadic encounters but through regular commerce, seasonal negotiations, and agreements recorded in medieval Japanese sources. These relationships placed the Ainu firmly within the economic orbit of the Japanese mainland, even as they remained culturally and politically independent. Documentary evidence from the late Heian and early Kamakura periods reveals that the earliest large-scale trade took place along established maritime corridors running between the Tsugaru Strait, the Oshima Peninsula, and key ports in northern Honshu. Ainu chiefs organized expeditions that transported highly valued northern products. Soft furs such as sable and fox, carved ivory from sea mammals, hawk feathers prized in elite hunting culture, marine oils, and large quantities of dried salmon. These goods were loaded into boats designed for coastal navigation, then brought south to Weijin trading partners who operated from fortified ports and small riverine hubs. In return, Ainu traders acquired items that were difficult or impossible to produce locally. Iron tools formed the backbone of this demand. Knives, spearheads, chisels, fishing hooks, and iron plates for repairing composite weapons. Alongside these came lacquerware, ceramics, clothing textiles, wine, and, significantly, rice. Rice held both economic and ceremonial importance. It circulated widely as a prestige food and symbol of exchange, often appearing in later accounts of diplomacy between Ainu leaders and Japanese officials. The inflow of iron in particular transformed everyday life in Ainu Koten, improving hunting efficiency, woodworking, and household production while deepening dependence on southern trade routes. The rise of the Ando clan during the Kamakura period reshaped this frontier economy. Positioned in the Tsugaru region, the Ando acted as intermediaries between the expanding military government of the Kamakura shogunate and the northern trade sphere. Their control over port towns such as Tosaminato allowed them to standardize exchange, collect customs duties, and enforce agreements with Ainu chiefs and other northern peoples. By the early 13th century, the Ando established trading posts along the Oshima Peninsula, seasonal centers where Weijin merchants and Ainu communities gathered to negotiate prices, settle disputes, and renew alliances. These commercial relationships became structured enough to appear in Japanese administrative records. The Azuma Kagami, a chronicle maintained by the Kamakura shogunate, contains accounts of Ainu envoys and shipments arriving in Honshu. While the chronicle's perspective is limited and shaped by courtly concerns, it provides rare documentary confirmation that trade was not simply informal barter but governed by agreements recognized at the highest levels of medieval Japanese authority. These records describe gifts exchanged between Ainu chiefs and Weijin officials, often framed as tribute in Japanese terminology, though in practice these were diplomatic transactions conducted among equals in their respective domains. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of intensifying contact. Weijin lacquerware and glazed pottery appear with increasing frequency in 12th to 14th century Ainu contexts, particularly in southern Hokkaido. Likewise, iron artifacts of mainland manufacture are found in villages that otherwise maintain traditional Ainu material culture, indicating selective adoption rather than wholesale assimilation. Conversely, goods of northern origin, especially furs and marine oils, have been discovered in Honshu sites far from the coast, showing that Ainu products passed through multiple layers of internal Japanese trade networks. These exchanges brought more than material goods. Stories, technologies, and rituals traveled as well, moving across cultural boundaries in subtle, cumulative ways. Some Ainu communities adopted small elements of Buddhist symbolism, not through conversion but through the repurposing of imported objects as ornaments, tools, or ritual items with new meanings. Weijin merchants, meanwhile, gained familiarity with Ainu languages, trade etiquette, and the ceremonial expectations involved in exchange. Negotiations often required feasting, gift-giving, and diplomacy that reinforced personal relationships between chiefs and traders, forming a social framework that stabilized commerce. Yet, commercial expansion also introduced fragility. As the Ando clan strengthened its control over maritime routes, Weijin influence began to shape the northern economy more assertively. Trade posts fixed the location and timing of exchange, reducing the flexibility Ainu groups had long relied on. Increasing demand for northern goods placed new pressures on hunting territories and fishing grounds. Meanwhile, access to iron and other imports created growing disparities between Ainu communities directly engaged in trade and those living farther inland or in northern regions with fewer Weijin contacts. By the 14th century, this imbalance had become acute. The economic partnership that once allowed both sides to benefit began tilting in favor of the Weijin, whose political and military structures could enforce advantageous terms. Ainu chiefs remained diplomatically skilled and fiercely autonomous, but their reliance on southern imports introduced vulnerabilities that had not existed in earlier centuries. The era of peaceful exchange that defined the 12th to 14th centuries was genuine and significant. It forged lasting ties across the strait, encouraged cultural sharing, and enriched both societies. But the same systems that connected Ainu communities to a wider world also laid the groundwork for later tensions born from unequal access to resources, shifting power dynamics, and the growing ambitions of medieval Japanese authorities. However, growing economic imbalance created tensions that soon escalated. By the late medieval era, trading partnerships had begun to fracture. What began as mutually beneficial commerce increasingly gave way to competition and localized disputes. By the late 14th century, Weijin traders and authorities were extending their control over ports and resource-rich territories, while Ainu communities sought to maintain autonomy over traditional hunting, fishing, and trading grounds. Chronicles such as the Azuma Kagami and later regional compilations note sporadic incidents of violence, often framed as disputes over tribute or the misappropriation of resources. Although terminology in these sources reflects a Weijin-centric perspective, archaeological evidence corroborates these tensions. Excavations of fortified sites, particularly along southern Hokkaido rivers and coastal points, reveal embankments, palisades, and defensive ditches constructed during the 14th century. These fortifications indicate a response to intermittent raids, theft, or encroachment, and suggest that Ainu communities began organizing defensive strategies at the village and regional level. Settlement patterns also shifted, with some inland villages relocating closer to rivers or defensible terrain, balancing access to resources with security concerns. Internal Ainu dynamics further complicated the situation. Inter-village competition over trade routes and access to the Tsugaru Strait sometimes resulted in temporary alliances or rivalries. Leaders capable of mediating these disputes gained influence, while those unable to maintain control risked losing prestige or access to crucial commodities. This pattern illustrates an early stage of political consolidation. Authority became increasingly tied to the capacity to negotiate both with other Ainu groups and with Weijin intermediaries. Archaeological assemblages, including imported iron tools concentrated in particular settlements, suggest that successful access to trade directly reinforced social and political hierarchies within Ainu communities. Conflicts were not uniformly violent. Many disputes were mediated through ritualized exchange or arbitration, a continuation of kin-based leadership practices discussed in Chapter 3. However, when negotiation failed, raids on rival villages or confrontations with Weijin traders occurred. Written accounts, while fragmentary and biased toward the Weijin perspective, describe punitive expeditions and retaliatory attacks that highlight the growing entanglement of economic dependence and social tension. These early confrontations foreshadow the more formalized conflicts that would dominate later centuries. The cumulative effect of these pressures created shifting power dynamics across Hokkaido. Coastal Ainu villages engaged in maritime trade maintained influence through resource control, while inland groups increasingly relied on strategic alliances and mobility. Weijin expansion, particularly under the authority of the Ando clan, introduced a political force capable of enforcing trade terms and exacting tribute. The resulting asymmetry destabilized previously balanced relationships, producing localized instability without yet generating full-scale warfare. Archaeological indicators, including concentrated weapon caches and reworked settlement layouts, demonstrate a society adapting to these evolving threats. This period also marks the emergence of Ainu identity in a politically charged context. Communities were compelled to negotiate their autonomy while integrating new material and technological influences from Weijin contact. Cultural continuity, maintained through rituals, subsistence strategies, and kin networks, coexisted with adaptive measures designed to navigate shifting political landscapes. The combination of trade dependency, resource competition, and external pressure illustrates a transitional phase. Ainu society remained cohesive, but its interactions with Weijin authorities became increasingly fraught. By the late 14th century, the foundations for sustained conflict had been laid. Sporadic disputes over trade rights and territorial control had escalated into organized defensive measures and strategic alliances, both within Ainu society and between Ainu groups and Weijin authorities. This dynamic would shape subsequent centuries, establishing patterns of interaction characterized by negotiation, competition, and intermittent violence. With the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate, Ainu-Weijin relations shifted from fluid contact to institutional control. In the early 17th century, the Tokugawa shogunate formalized northern administration by recognizing the Matsumi clan as the sole intermediary between Weijin Japan and Ainu communities. This political decision codified a system that had previously been flexible, informal, and negotiated largely at the village level. The Matsumi were granted extensive autonomy in exchange for their role as enforcers of shogunal policy, including responsibility for trade regulation, tax collection, and oversight of frontier settlements. Unlike other daimyo, they were largely exempt from obligations such as sankenkotai, the mandatory attendance at Edo, reflecting the strategic importance and logistical challenges of governing the northern periphery. Matsumi authority was expressed through the construction of fortified castle towns, which served as administrative, military, and commercial hubs. Matsumi Castle, completed in the early 1600s, became the central locus for governance, housing officials charged with regulating Ainu trade and collecting tribute. From these urban centers, smaller trade posts and warehouses extended control across the southern and eastern Hokkaido coastlines. Archaeological surveys of these sites reveal large-scale storage facilities for dried salmon, furs, and other products extracted from Ainu villages, alongside fortifications designed to assert dominance and project military capability. The institutional framework of the Matsumi domain also involved the formalization of taxation. Ainu communities were required to provide annual tribute, typically in the form of furs, oil, fish, and other regional commodities. This system transformed the previously reciprocal trade relationships of the medieval period into structured economic obligations. Records from the early 17th century indicate that tribute lists were carefully maintained, with specific quotas assigned to individual koten and households. Noncompliance could lead to punitive expeditions or temporary suspension of trade, enforcing Matsumi authority while also embedding the clan into the social and economic life of Ainu society. Trade itself was monopolized under Matsumi control. Wagen merchants were prohibited from engaging directly with Ainu villages without Matsumi oversight, consolidating the clan's role as both regulator and intermediary. This policy generated significant economic leverage, allowing the Matsumi to control pricing, dictate exchange terms, and restrict the flow of high-demand goods such as iron, cloth, and rice. Archaeological evidence from warehouse sites shows concentrated deposits of imported Japanese items, suggesting systematic distribution from the castle towns outward to local trade posts. At the same time, items sent north from Ainu villages, furs, oil, and marine products, were funneled through the Matsumi system, reinforcing the clan's centrality. The clan's unique position also allowed it to manage relations with both Ainu and shogunate authorities. While obligated to ensure that tribute was collected and frontier order maintained, the Matsumi could operate with considerable discretion, adapting enforcement strategies to local circumstances. Letters and administrative records indicate that they often negotiated with prominent Ainu leaders, balancing coercion with incentives to maintain compliance. This reflects an interpretive insight. Matsumi power depended not only on military capability, but on the social and economic networks already present within Ainu society. Another dimension of Matsumi governance involved the strategic placement of fortified posts in key resource zones. These locations, situated near rivers, salmon runs, and maritime channels, enabled the monitoring of Ainu movements and the enforcement of trade regulations. Archaeological studies show that such posts were lightly garrisoned but well supplied, indicating reliance on authority backed by ritualized and symbolic displays of power rather than large standing forces. Seasonal cycles continued to shape Ainu subsistence, but now under a framework constrained by the Matsumi administrative apparatus. Cultural interaction persisted, but under new parameters. While Ainu communities retained ceremonial practices, including bear rituals and seasonal festivals, Matsumi oversight increasingly influenced the selection of tribute goods and timing of exchanges. Imported items from Honshu became integral to both social prestige and economic strategy, altering patterns of local production and consumption. This dynamic demonstrates a second interpretive insight. Institutional control reshaped long-standing Ainu systems of reciprocity, creating new dependencies that reinforced Matsumi authority without immediately erasing traditional practices. By centralizing authority, the Tokugawa-era framework effectively integrated the northern frontier into Japan's political economy while maintaining Ainu villages as distinct cultural and social units. Matsumi autonomy, castle-based administration, trade monopolies, and taxation practices established the conditions for both economic transformation and eventual social friction. These structures provided stability in the short term but also generated inequalities and pressures that would later provoke resistance and unrest among Ainu communities. Matsumi's trade monopolies soon transformed economic relations. Controlled trade reshaped Ainu life more profoundly than military conflict. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, the Matsumi clan consolidated authority over northern commerce through a system of contract-based trade posts, known as basho. These posts functioned as both distribution centers for imported Japanese goods and collection points for Ainu tribute. Merchants stationed at the basho operated under written agreements with Matsumi authorities, specifying quotas of furs, dried salmon, and other commodities to be collected from individual villages. This arrangement ensured that Matsumi control was codified, predictable, and enforceable, marking a decisive shift from the fluid exchange networks of the medieval period to a centrally regulated frontier economy. Prices and terms of exchange were strictly fixed by Matsumi administrators. Documentary sources, including shogunate records and merchant diaries, indicate that Ainu communities were often required to accept iron tools, textiles, or rice at rates set by Matsumi officials, leaving little room for negotiation. In effect, Ainu producers traded high-value northern goods for controlled quantities of Japanese imports, creating structural economic dependence. Archaeological finds corroborate this pattern. Imported iron implements, lacquerware, and ceramics appear consistently at sites near Matsumi trade posts, while locally produced items were increasingly funneled to these controlled distribution points rather than circulating freely within Ainu society. The labor demands associated with this system further altered Ainu life. Communities were expected to supply workers for processing tribute goods, transporting furs, and maintaining access routes to the basho. Seasonal schedules were coordinated to align with Matsumi administrative priorities rather than the natural rhythms of subsistence, such as salmon runs or hunting cycles. Records describe temporary relocation of village groups to facilitate deliveries, demonstrating that trade obligations could dictate the timing and location of Ainu labor. This illustrates an interpretive insight. Economic regulation functioned as a mechanism of social control, shaping mobility, labor allocation, and resource management without direct military intervention. Fixed-price trading and the influx of imported goods also transformed internal social structures. Leaders who could negotiate effectively with Matsumi merchants gained prestige and influence, often consolidating power within their clans. Conversely, communities or households less able to meet tribute quotas faced diminished status or exclusion from trade. Archaeological evidence suggests differential access to imported items such as iron tools or luxury ceramics, reinforcing hierarchies and creating disparities that had not existed under pre-Matsumi trade practices. This selective accumulation of goods functioned as both a marker of social authority and a tool for reinforcing Matsumi oversight. Cultural consequences were also significant. Imported items became central to Ainu ceremonial life, including rituals connected to bear worship, ancestor veneration, and seasonal feasts. The integration of Japanese-made tools, textiles, and ornaments into these practices illustrates that material culture mediated both continuity and adaptation. While Ainu traditions persisted, they were increasingly intertwined with the economic imperatives imposed by the Matsumi trade system. This duality reflects a second interpretive insight. Cultural persistence could coexist with structural dependence, but economic integration inevitably reshaped community priorities. Historical documentation provides quantitative clarity. Matsumi records indicate annual quotas specifying the number of furs, salmon, and oil to be collected from individual villages. Merchant diaries describe the negotiation process and the enforcement mechanisms employed to ensure compliance, including temporary embargoes or punitive interventions. These records demonstrate the precision and bureaucratic sophistication of Matsumi administration, highlighting the systematic nature of economic control. This structured approach contrasts sharply with earlier medieval trade, which had relied primarily on personal relationships, reciprocal exchange, and seasonal coordination. Trade monopolies also had ecological and economic ramifications. Pressure to supply fixed tribute quotas incentivized increased hunting, fishing, and foraging beyond subsistence needs. Archaeological sites show intensified exploitation of salmon runs and fur-bearing animals during the early Matsumi period, suggesting both demographic and environmental stress on northern ecosystems. Villages engaged in heavy tribute production were compelled to balance subsistence priorities with economic obligations, sometimes relocating temporarily to exploit distant resources, a pattern documented in both oral tradition and material remains. These dynamics collectively illustrate how the Matsumi system exercised power without extensive military engagement. Authority was enforced through economic regulation, bureaucratic oversight, and strategic control of scarce imported commodities. Communities adapted to this framework by negotiating quotas, coordinating labor, and integrating new goods into social and ritual life. Yet dependence was increasingly inevitable. Archaeological and documentary evidence converge to show that economic leverage became the primary tool for shaping Ainu behavior, mediating leadership, and regulating inter-village relations. The cumulative effect of controlled trade was profound. Ainu communities became enmeshed in a system that dictated resource distribution, labor patterns, and social hierarchies. By embedding Matsumi authority in everyday economic practice, the Tokugawa administration achieved a level of control that military campaigns alone could not sustain. This transformation established the conditions for conflict, as communities confronted the pressures imposed by rigid economic obligations. Economic pressure would soon trigger organized resistance. Ainu leaders did not accept Matsumi control passively. Resistance to Matsumi authority manifested repeatedly across the 17th and 18th centuries, reflecting both the limits of economic and administrative control and the enduring capacity of Ainu communities to mobilize against perceived exploitation. One of the most significant uprisings occurred during Shikushane's revolt, between 1669 and 1672. Shikushane, a prominent leader in southern Hokkaido, united multiple Ainu villages along the Oshima Peninsula and the southern coastal regions in response to growing grievances over trade monopolies, unfair tribute demands, and territorial encroachment by Wajan settlers. Matsumi documents describe coordinated attacks on trading posts and defensive fortifications, demonstrating the strategic sophistication of Ainu mobilization. The revolt arose from structural pressures established under Tokugawa-era economic policies. Fixed tribute quotas, enforced through trade posts, had increasingly strained Ainu subsistence systems. The forced provision of furs, dried salmon, and other resources disrupted traditional hunting, fishing, and storage patterns. Shikushane leveraged these shared grievances to forge inter-village alliances, temporarily overcoming long-standing local rivalries. Archaeological evidence from contemporaneous sites, including abandoned settlements and burned post structures, supports historical accounts of coordinated attacks and retaliatory campaigns. Shikushane's revolt ended in 1672 with Matsumi forces, reinforced by loyalist Ainu and Wajan militias, suppressing the uprising. While the immediate military outcome restored Matsumi control, the revolt had lasting implications for political organization. Records indicate that the shogunate and Matsumi authorities subsequently imposed stricter oversight over trade posts, monitored Ainu leadership more closely, and codified the roles of village chiefs to prevent future coordinated resistance. This illustrates an interpretive insight. Uprisings prompted structural adjustments that increased administrative penetration into previously autonomous communities. A second major episode, the Kunisher Rebellion of 1789, emerged from similar tensions in the Kuril Islands. Primary sources, including Matsumi reports and oral Ainu accounts, indicate that overexploitation of marine resources and disputes over trade practices triggered localized mobilization. Participants attacked Matsumi officials and Japanese settlers, briefly disrupting the flow of tribute goods. The rebellion's suppression involved decisive military response and punitive measures, reinforcing Matsumi authority while leaving a legacy of distrust and caution in Ainu-Wajan relations. Smaller-scale conflicts occurred throughout the 18th century, often related to perceived inequities in trade, encroachment on hunting territories, or disputes over leadership recognition. Missionary and traveler accounts describe episodes of resistance in the Nemuro and southern Hokkaido regions, providing corroborative evidence for the systematic pressures documented in Matsumi administrative records. These sources collectively show that Ainu resistance was neither isolated nor random. It reflected coherent political calculation within affected communities. Uprisings also illuminate broader social and cultural dynamics. Leaders like Shikushane drew authority from both hereditary prestige and demonstrated capacity to coordinate labor and military action. Participation in rebellion often required negotiation among villages, the mobilization of hunters and fishermen, and careful timing aligned with seasonal resource availability. Archaeological remains of temporary encampments, abandoned settlements, and defensive structures provide material confirmation of the logistical planning underlying these movements. A third interpretive insight emerges. Ainu resistance was shaped as much by local environmental and subsistence considerations as by political objectives. While Matsumi forces ultimately defeated these uprisings, the repeated challenges underscored the limits of imposed control and the resilience of Ainu social networks. Each conflict prompted adjustments in the administration of trade, taxation, and settlement, embedding lessons that reinforced the shogunate's capacity to enforce order in the north. At the same time, the uprisings reinforced collective Ainu identity, articulating both cultural cohesion and political agency in response to external pressures. By the end of the 18th century, Matsumi authority over Ainu communities had been militarily reinforced and economically institutionalized. The scale and frequency of resistance highlighted persistent local grievances, but the combination of trade monopoly, fortified posts, and shogunal backing ensured that Ainu political autonomy was sharply constrained. Historical records, material culture, and oral traditions together demonstrate the complex interplay between resistance and governance in this period. Defeat in these uprisings would permanently shift the balance of power. Ainu communities in Sakhalin occupied one of East Asia's most contested frontiers. From the 16th century onward, Sakhalin became a critical arena for Ainu social, economic, and political activity. Ainu settlements on the island were strategically located along rivers and coastal zones, facilitating access to rich marine and forest resources, including salmon, sea mammals, and fur-bearing animals. These communities maintained extensive networks of trade with neighboring Nifk and Uilta groups, exchanging northern goods such as furs, ivory, and dried fish for iron implements, ceramics, and other Japanese imports. Archaeological evidence, including fortified village remains and caches of imported materials, demonstrates both the scale of Ainu settlement and the sophistication of their trade logistics. Sakhalin Ainu also served as intermediaries in broader regional commerce. Japanese traders seeking furs and marine products relied on local Ainu knowledge of geography, resource cycles, and diplomatic negotiation. Likewise, Russian merchants and explorers entering the Amur and Okhotsk regions depended on Ainu cooperation to access coastal and inland resources. Historical records and Russian travel accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries highlight the Ainu role in linking these diverse spheres of influence, emphasizing their capacity for negotiation, strategic mobility, and economic adaptation. Material culture reinforces the documentary record. Excavated sites reveal storage pits, iron and bronze artifacts of Japanese origin, and northern trade goods that circulated widely across the island. Fortifications, including palisades and elevated dwellings, indicate that communities actively managed both defense and trade, balancing cooperation with neighboring groups and preparation for potential conflicts. This combination of economic acumen and territorial control underscores an interpretive insight. Sakhalin Ainu functioned not merely as peripheral actors, but as key agents in a multi-directional trade network that connected Japan, Russia, and the circumpolar world. The settlement patterns and trade strategies of Sakhalin Ainu also reflect adaptive responses to environmental pressures. Seasonal migrations aligned with fishing and hunting cycles ensured sustainable resource use, while maximizing participation in regional exchange. Leadership within these communities remained kin-based and localized, mirroring Hokkaido structures, but included elements of coordination for intergroup commerce. Archaeological evidence suggests that some sites functioned as temporary hubs for storing traded goods, facilitating both internal redistribution and external exchange. These dynamics reveal the strategic importance of Sakhalin for both economic and political reasons. Ainu communities controlled access to valuable commodities while maintaining independence through mobility, alliances, and negotiation. Their intermediary role enhanced their bargaining power with both Japanese and Russian actors, allowing them to navigate the competing ambitions of distant states without surrendering local autonomy. A second interpretive insight emerges. Northern Ainu societies exemplified the interplay between geography, resource control, and diplomatic leverage in shaping frontier power. By the early 18th century, Sakhalin Ainu had become a linchpin in northern trade networks. Japanese interest persisted, particularly among Matsumi merchants seeking to extend their economic reach. while Russian expansionism introduced new opportunities and risks. The resulting environment required careful balancing, maintaining trade relationships, defending territories, and mediating intergroup relations. Archaeological and textual sources collectively illustrate the nuanced strategies Ainu leaders employed to preserve autonomy while engaging with multiple external powers. Meanwhile, contact intensified with a new northern power, Russia. By the 18th century, the Ainu world stood between two expanding empires. Russian exploration and expansion into the Far East brought the Ainu into contact with a new set of political and economic actors. Beginning in the mid-17th century, Russian expeditions along the Amur River, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands aimed to secure fur resources and establish trading posts. Archival records from the Russian-American Company and earlier Cossack reports describe encounters with Ainu communities, highlighting both trade and occasional conflict. Ainu groups, already experienced in managing multidirectional commerce, engaged strategically with Russian explorers, offering local knowledge, labor, and goods in exchange for firearms, metal tools, and textiles. Trade networks quickly adapted to accommodate Russian demands. Furs, particularly sable and fox, became highly sought after, supplementing the ongoing Matsumi-controlled exchange with Japan. Archaeological evidence from Sakhalin and the Kurils shows Russian-manufactured iron items, glass beads, and other imports appearing alongside traditional Ainu artifacts. Missionary activity, primarily orthodox in nature, also introduced new forms of cultural influence, though adoption was limited and often syncretic. Written accounts note that Ainu leaders assessed these foreign incursions pragmatically, maintaining autonomy while selectively incorporating external goods and knowledge. Diplomatic interactions were complex. Russian envoys frequently relied on Ainu intermediaries to navigate difficult terrain, secure guides, and facilitate negotiations with other indigenous groups such as the Nifk and Uilta. Conversely, Ainu leaders used these contacts to bolster their negotiating positions with Matsumi authorities, effectively leveraging Russian presence as a counterbalance. This illustrates an interpretive insight. The Ainu were not passive recipients of imperial expansion but active agents mediating between competing powers. Conflict also emerged. Disputes over access to hunting grounds, the movement of Russian expeditions, and competition for trade created localized tensions. Russian reports describe raids on isolated Ainu settlements and occasional punitive expeditions, while Japanese records sometimes noted the potential for Ainu groups to shift allegiances under Russian influence. Archaeological traces of temporary fortifications and abandoned sites suggest that Ainu communities responded to these pressures by consolidating settlements and reinforcing defensive structures. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Russian expansion intensified competition over northern resources, particularly in Sakhalin and the Kurils. This period of dual imperial pressure intersected with existing Japanese-controlled trade networks, creating an environment in which Ainu decision-making was increasingly constrained by external forces. However, Ainu participation in trade and diplomacy demonstrates their capacity to navigate these pressures, maintaining local autonomy while adapting to shifting political realities. A second interpretive insight emerges. Northern Ainu societies exemplified strategic engagement in a complex, multi-imperial frontier. Archival correspondence from both Russian and Japanese sources documents the negotiation of formal and informal agreements. Gift exchanges, hostage arrangements, and seasonal trade permits illustrate a system of layered diplomacy. These practices enabled Ainu communities to manage inter-imperial relations, ensure access to critical goods, and protect core subsistence areas. Material culture, iron tools, beads, and imported items integrated into daily and ritual use reflects these adaptive strategies. Competition between Russia and Japan heightened pressure on Ainu communities. The Kuril chain hosted some of the most culturally distinct Ainu communities. Kuril Ainu settlements were geographically dispersed across islands stretching from Hokkaido to Kamchatka, creating unique adaptations to maritime and insular environments. Villages were typically small, with seasonal movement dictated by fishing cycles, bird hunting, and marine mammal exploitation. Archaeological evidence indicates distinctive material culture, including specialized harpoon designs, comb-like bone tools, and island-specific ornamentation, reflecting both resource adaptation and localized aesthetic traditions. These communities maintained active trade networks with Sakhalin Ainu, Hokkaido villages, and neighboring indigenous groups, exchanging furs, dried fish, and crafted items for iron tools, cloth, and beads. Cultural variation within the Kurils was also linguistic and ritualistic. Observers in the 18th century documented differences in dialect, ceremonial practice, and subsistence techniques compared to Hokkaido Ainu. Bear rituals, for example, were adapted to smaller populations and island ecology, while funerary practices often integrated local environmental symbolism. These variations demonstrate the interpretive insight that Ainu culture was not monolithic. Rather, regional ecologies and inter-island mobility shaped distinct expressions of identity within a broader cultural framework. The Kuril Ainu also played a strategic role in regional trade networks. Their intermediary position enabled movement of goods between Sakhalin, Hokkaido, and northern Pacific actors, including Russian explorers and traders. Archival Russian documents note Kuril Ainu serving as guides, intermediaries, and negotiators, leveraging their knowledge of maritime routes and seasonal resource availability. This highlights a second interpretive insight. Kuril communities exercised agency by mediating commerce and diplomacy, despite geographic isolation. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, imperial expansion increasingly threatened Kuril Ainu autonomy. Russian colonization pushed northward while Japanese Matsumi and later state agents extended control southward. Missionary accounts, colonial reports, and material evidence document displacement, population contraction, and forced integration into imposed trade systems. Archaeological traces of abandoned villages, burned structures, and reconfigured settlement patterns reveal the impact of these external pressures on Kuril Ainu social organization and cultural continuity. As imperial competition intensified, Ainu autonomy declined. The Meiji Restoration brought a radical shift in how Japan governed its northern territories. Following the political consolidation of Japan in 1868, the Meiji government prioritized the formal incorporation of Hokkaido into the modern nation-state. The creation of the Hokkaido Development Commission, Kaitakushi, in 1869 marked the centralization of administrative control, replacing the semi-autonomous Matsumi domain with state-directed governance. The Kaitakushi implemented comprehensive land surveys, mapping natural resources and establishing property rights in ways that disregarded traditional Ainu claims. Government records from this period indicate that the entirety of Hokkaido was designated as state property, effectively rendering Ainu villages and hunting grounds subject to imperial oversight. Administrative reforms extended to taxation, settlement regulation, and resource management. Ainu communities, previously semi-autonomous under Matsumi authority, were now legally subordinated to Japanese law and municipal structures. Land use policies often mandated relocation, restricting access to traditional hunting, fishing, and foraging areas. Reports from Kaitakushi officials describe the establishment of designated villages for Ainu populations, with accompanying expectations regarding agriculture, labor, and assimilation into Japanese social norms. This process institutionalized the marginalization of Ainu land rights, embedding economic and political dependence within the framework of a modernizing state. The Kaitakushi also sought to integrate Hokkaido into national economic and infrastructural plans. Road networks, ports, and towns were constructed to facilitate Japanese settlement and resource extraction, often encroaching on territories critical to Ainu subsistence. Surveys and administrative correspondence reveal a deliberate strategy to encourage migration from Honshu and other regions, establishing a Japanese demographic presence that would consolidate state authority. Archaeological and documentary evidence indicates that these interventions disrupted established settlement patterns, altered seasonal migration, and created new centers of political and economic control. This period introduced systematic education and cultural oversight. Schools were established to teach Japanese language, customs, and civic practices to Ainu youth, while the use of Ainu language and customary law was discouraged. Kaitakushi reports reflect the goal of fostering productive citizens aligned with state objectives, reinforcing assimilation through institutionalized instruction. Interpretive insight emerges. Administrative reform was not merely bureaucratic. It functioned as a mechanism for reshaping Ainu identity and subordinating indigenous governance within the modern nation-state. A second interpretive insight relates to economic transformation. By designating Ainu lands as state property and reallocating key resources to Japanese settlers, the Meiji administration fundamentally altered local subsistence systems. Fishing rights, forestry access, and hunting grounds were increasingly regulated by permits and taxation, forcing Ainu communities into wage labor, seasonal harvesting contracts, or marginal lands. Kaitakushi reports and petitions from Ainu leaders document resistance to these measures, highlighting the tension between traditional practices and state-imposed structures. Despite these pressures, Ainu communities demonstrated resilience. Some adapted to new economic realities by participating in emerging markets, engaging in wage labor, or relocating to newly designated villages. Others sought to preserve traditional practices clandestinely or negotiate exemptions from restrictive policies. The interplay between imposed administrative structures and local adaptation illustrates a third interpretive insight. Ainu agency persisted even amid profound political and territorial restructuring. By the end of the 1870s, the Meiji state had fully annexed Hokkaido, imposed centralized governance, and redefined land ownership. These reforms laid the foundation for systematic assimilation, resource control, and social reorganization, transforming centuries-old patterns of autonomy into a highly regulated, state-centered framework. Administrative reform under the Kaitakushi established the structural preconditions for subsequent policies targeting cultural, economic, and political integration of Ainu populations. Land policy was only the beginning. New legislation sought to reshape Ainu society at its foundations. In 1899, the Meiji government enacted the Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act, Kyudo Ainu Hogoho, representing a decisive legal framework for the assimilation of Ainu communities. The law formally recognized the Ainu as a distinct population while simultaneously imposing a set of obligations aimed at transforming their social, economic, and cultural practices. Government records, including Ministry of Home Affairs reports and local administrative documentation, indicate that the act mandated the adoption of Japanese-style agriculture, restructured land tenure, and restricted traditional subsistence methods such as hunting, fishing, and foraging in designated state-controlled zones. Land ownership under the act was tightly regulated. Ainu families were permitted to cultivate plots, but these were often marginal lands unsuited to traditional livelihoods. Title to larger or resource-rich areas was reserved for Japanese settlers or state-managed projects, reinforcing structural dependency. Official surveys recorded both the extent of these allocations and the criteria for eligibility, creating a bureaucratic framework that limited mobility and imposed fiscal obligations through property taxes. Interpretive insight emerges. Land legislation functioned as an instrument of socio-economic restructuring, displacing traditional resource management in favor of state-centered control. Compulsory agriculture constituted a central element of the policy. Ainu households were required to adopt crop cultivation, often under supervision or guidance from government-appointed advisors. Reports describe instruction in rice and barley farming, irrigation practices, and the use of imported tools. While intended to foster self-sufficiency within a Japanese economic model, these measures frequently conflicted with seasonal subsistence strategies rooted in fishing, hunting, and wild plant collection. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence indicates partial compliance alongside persistent informal practices, demonstrating that adaptation was uneven and negotiated within local contexts. The act also imposed restrictions on cultural practices. Public performance of bear rituals, ancestral ceremonies, and other religious observances was curtailed, with authorities framing these as backward or incompatible with modern civic life. School curricula emphasized Japanese language and customs, discouraging the use of Ainu language and oral traditions. Missionary and local administrative reports document enforcement of these measures, illustrating both direct oversight and subtler social pressures. This highlights a second interpretive insight. The legislation combined economic, legal, and cultural mechanisms to consolidate assimilation into a coherent state policy. Economic effects of the act were substantial. Government statistics collected in the early 20th century indicate shifts in occupational patterns, with increasing numbers of Ainu engaging in wage labor, seasonal fisheries for Japanese-owned enterprises, and small-scale agriculture. Dependence on state-sanctioned markets supplanted traditional exchange networks, concentrating wealth and goods under Japanese control. Demographic data show population movements towards settlement villages, reflecting both administrative encouragement and resource pressures. This structural reorganization underscores how legislation facilitated the absorption of Ainu communities into the broader Meiji economic order. At the same time, resistance and adaptation persisted. Some Ainu maintained clandestine observance of rituals, preserved language use within households, or engaged in small-scale subsistence production outside regulated plots. Correspondence between Ainu leaders and government officials indicates negotiation over land allocation, taxation, and cultural allowances. These interactions demonstrate a third interpretive insight. Even within legally constrained frameworks, communities exercised agency to preserve elements of identity and livelihood. By codifying land allocation, economic obligations, and cultural restrictions, the 1899 Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act established the foundational legal mechanisms for state-directed assimilation. It formalized decades of policy initiated under the Kaitakushi, translating administrative precedent into statutory authority. While promoting integration into Japanese economic and social structures, it simultaneously disrupted centuries-old patterns of autonomy, settlement, and subsistence. These changes also reshaped cultural and religious life. Assimilation policies reached into religious, linguistic, and familial life. Following the implementation of the 1899 Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act, Ainu cultural practices faced systematic restriction under the Meiji state. The use of the Ainu language was discouraged in schools and public administration, replaced by mandatory Japanese instruction. Ethnographic studies from the early 20th century, including observations by anthropologists such as John Batchelor and subsequent Japanese scholars, document a significant decline in intergenerational language transmission. Ainu children were increasingly educated in Japanese, creating both linguistic and cultural discontinuities within communities. Religious practices, particularly the bear ceremonial, iomant, and seasonal rituals, were curtailed by authorities who viewed them as obstacles to civilized assimilation. Reports indicate that public observance of these ceremonies required official approval, and in many cases, villages adapted by performing rituals privately or modifying them to align superficially with Japanese expectations. Archaeological evidence and missionary accounts corroborate these adaptations, showing a reduction in ritual structures and associated material culture, such as ceremonial altars and carved prayer sticks, ikupasui. Interpretive insight. These constraints illustrate how state power penetrated everyday spiritual life, reorienting communal priorities under legal and social pressure. Social mobility was similarly affected. Legal and economic frameworks prioritized Japanese-style agricultural productivity and wage labor over traditional leadership roles and kin-based authority. Ainu household heads who complied with state mandates could gain limited recognition within local administrative structures, while those resisting or failing to meet imposed obligations experienced marginalization. Early anthropological accounts detail shifts in village hierarchy, with individuals mediating between the state and community increasingly controlling access to resources, education, and trade opportunities. This highlights a second interpretive insight. Assimilation policies restructured social hierarchies, creating new forms of authority aligned with state objectives rather than traditional lineage. Education functioned as both a tool of cultural transmission and social engineering. State-run schools emphasized literacy, arithmetic, and Japanese civic norms, while discouraging knowledge of Ainu subsistence techniques, oral histories, and cultural practices. Enrollment statistics from the early 20th century show growing participation rates among Ainu children, but curriculum content reflects a deliberate focus on Japanese cultural and linguistic assimilation. Oral histories reveal community strategies to maintain informal instruction in traditional practices alongside formal schooling, demonstrating resilience and adaptation. The cumulative social consequences of these policies were profound. Linguistic decline, altered religious observance, constrained mobility, and shifts in leadership patterns combined to transform Ainu daily life. Anthropological studies note increased reliance on state-sanctioned economic activities, a contraction of traditional subsistence territories, and growing dependence on Japanese intermediaries for legal and commercial matters. Interpretive insight. The intersection of policy, education, and economic integration illustrates a comprehensive system designed to absorb Ainu society into the modern Japanese nation-state, eroding pre-existing cultural autonomy while producing new forms of negotiated identity. By the late Meiji period, these cultural restrictions had reshaped intergenerational transmission of knowledge, ritual practice, and communal governance. While adaptation and resistance persisted, the legal and educational frameworks imposed structural limitations on the reproduction of Ainu cultural and social systems. The effects of these transformations became foundational to the 20th century experience, influencing patterns of settlement, identity, and political engagement. The 20th century would bring new challenges and eventual change. The early 20th century marked a period of profound demographic pressure. Ainu communities experienced significant demographic changes during the early 20th century, driven by both state policies and broader social transformations. Census records from 1900 to 1930 indicate a gradual decline in population, partly attributable to limited access to healthcare, nutritional challenges in constrained settlement areas, and exposure to infectious diseases in newly centralized villages. Ethnographic surveys conducted by Japanese officials and missionaries document smaller household sizes, decreased fertility in resource-stressed areas, and an increasing proportion of Ainu living in proximity to Japanese settlements. Economic marginalization was a central factor in shaping these demographic trends. Traditional subsistence activities, hunting, fishing, and foraging, were increasingly restricted by state-regulated land and resource policies. As a result, many Ainu families entered wage labor in fisheries, forestry, or seasonal agricultural work. Archival employment records and local surveys indicate that Ainu laborers often received lower compensation than Japanese counterparts, reinforcing economic dependency. This structural marginalization contributed to reduced household stability and migration pressures, as families sought access to more viable livelihoods in urban centers or along coastal fisheries. Settlement reorganization further influenced social conditions. Villages were often relocated into areas designated by local authorities, resulting in smaller plots, limited access to waterways, and proximity to Japanese settlers. Anthropological studies and mission reports describe adjustments in household composition, communal organization, and labor allocation. Traditional leadership structures persisted to some degree, but were subordinated to administrative oversight, limiting the authority of village chiefs and elders. Interpretive insight. Demographic and social pressures were intertwined with structural transformations imposed by state policy, producing shifts in both population patterns and communal organization. Education and health policies also shaped demographic outcomes. State schools enforced Japanese language and civic instruction, while public health initiatives aimed at hygiene and vaccination had uneven coverage. Historical accounts note that these interventions improved mortality outcomes in some areas but simultaneously disrupted traditional knowledge transmission, particularly regarding local medicinal practices, subsistence planning, and social networks. The cumulative effect reinforced dependence on state infrastructure while eroding customary resilience mechanisms. Migration patterns offer additional evidence of demographic adaptation. Some Ainu families relocated seasonally to pursue employment in fisheries or forestry, while others moved permanently to towns and port cities. Employment records, ethnographic field notes, and municipal censuses illustrate the emergence of new Ainu social spaces in urban environments, where traditional kinship networks were reconfigured to accommodate wage labor and access to education. This highlights a second interpretive insight. demographic change was not merely a decline in numbers, but a reorganization of social, economic, and spatial relationships under external pressures. Despite these challenges, Ainu communities maintained cultural continuity in private spheres. Oral histories and missionary observations indicate continued use of Ainu language within households, preservation of ritual knowledge, and seasonal practice of subsistence skills. These practices suggest that demographic pressures, while significant, did not entirely extinguish cultural identity. A third interpretive insight emerges. Resilience in the face of marginalization demonstrates the capacity of Ainu society to adapt strategically to structural constraints while preserving elements of communal knowledge. By the 1930s, demographic decline, economic marginalization, and spatial reorganization had collectively reshaped Ainu life. These conditions laid the groundwork for emerging forms of social and political activism, as communities sought to address inequities and assert cultural identity within the context of a modernizing Japanese state. Amid these conditions, activism gradually emerged. Even as assimilation advanced, documentation of Ainu culture intensified. During the early 20th century, the study and documentation of Ainu culture expanded significantly, driven by both Japanese and foreign ethnographers. Scholars collected material culture, linguistic data, and oral histories, often under the premise of preserving vanishing traditions. Among the most influential researchers was Bronislaw Pilsudski, a Polish ethnographer who settled in Hokkaido after exile in Russia. Between 1903 and 1912, Pilsudski systematically recorded Ainu language, folktales, music, and ritual practices, producing a corpus that remains foundational for modern scholarship. His fieldwork highlighted both the diversity of regional practices and the resilience of Ainu cultural knowledge, even under conditions of social and economic marginalization. Japanese ethnographers, including Yanagita Kunio and other contemporaries, also contributed to documentation, focusing on material artifacts, customs, and oral traditions. Government-supported studies were often framed within a paradigm of assimilation, emphasizing the perceived obsolescence of Ainu culture, which introduced interpretive bias. Archival research indicates that descriptions of ritual, subsistence, and social organization were sometimes filtered through notions of civility and modernity, influencing both contemporary perception and subsequent historiography. Interpretive insight. While early research preserved critical data, it must be read critically, acknowledging how social and political contexts shaped ethnographic interpretation. Material collections, including tools, clothing, and ritual implements, provide tangible evidence of continuity and regional variation. Museums in Hokkaido and abroad hold assemblages that trace differences between inland and coastal Ainu, Sakhalin, and Kuril communities, and intergenerational adaptations. Such collections, combined with photographic records and audio documentation, illustrate both everyday life and ceremonial practices. A second interpretive insight emerges. These archival and material resources reveal Ainu agency in negotiating which practices persisted and how they were presented to outsiders. Early linguistic studies also contributed to cultural preservation. Pilsudski and other scholars documented phonology, grammar, and vocabulary, allowing reconstruction of dialectal differences across Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kurils. These efforts not only safeguarded language knowledge but provided a framework for later revitalization initiatives. Nonetheless, early documentation was uneven. Areas under more intensive assimilation pressure were less represented, reflecting the impact of state policies on research accessibility and cultural visibility. The accumulation of ethnographic and linguistic data laid the groundwork for later political consciousness. By highlighting both distinctiveness and historical continuity, these records offered Ainu communities evidence of cultural legitimacy and identity. This dual role of research, preserving knowledge while shaping narratives of decline, underscores the complexity of early 20th century ethnography. A third interpretive insight: documentation was simultaneously a tool of cultural preservation and a mechanism shaped by colonial and assimilationist perspectives. Cultural preservation soon evolved into political advocacy. The foundation of modern Ainu advocacy began before the war. The first organized efforts to advocate for Ainu rights emerged in the early 20th century, culminating in the establishment of the Hokkaido Ainu Association, Hokkaido Ainu Kyokai, in 1930. This organization sought to address social and economic grievances, including land dispossession, labor inequities, and restrictions on cultural practice. Archival documents from the association highlight coordinated petitions to local authorities, efforts to secure educational opportunities for Ainu youth, and initiatives to preserve traditional crafts and language. These early organizational activities reflect the capacity of communities to mobilize collectively within the constraints imposed by the Japanese state. Post-war conditions created new opportunities and challenges for Ainu activism. Following Japan's defeat in 1945, the Allied occupation prompted broader reconsideration of minority rights and legal structures. Ainu leaders leveraged this context to press for recognition, land rights, and educational reform. Government records indicate that several local and regional Ainu associations formed during this period, coordinating activities to document historical grievances and promote cultural revitalization. Ethnographic interviews and contemporary newspapers provide evidence of community meetings, workshops, and advocacy campaigns emphasizing both social welfare and cultural preservation. Mid-20th century activism extended into legal and political arenas. Organizations lobbied for legislation addressing land disputes, economic development, and educational inclusion. The focus on cultural preservation continued alongside material concerns, with initiatives to teach the Ainu language, maintain ritual practices, and sustain traditional craft production. Archival reports show collaboration with sympathetic scholars, journalists, and municipal officials, illustrating the interplay between grassroots activism and academic support. Interpretive insight. These efforts demonstrate that modern Ainu identity was forged through coordinated action linking cultural continuity with socio-political advocacy. Demographic and social data from the period reveal both progress and ongoing challenges. Membership in associations remained concentrated in areas with historically dense Ainu populations, while urban migration and assimilation pressures limited broader participation. Economic marginalization persisted, particularly in peripheral fisheries, forestry, and agricultural labor, but association-led programs helped create limited vocational support and educational access. This highlights a second interpretive insight. Early organizations functioned simultaneously as cultural preservers and social advocates, mediating between traditional lifeways and emerging modern structures. The institutionalization of Ainu advocacy during this era laid the foundation for subsequent developments in the late 20th century. Networks established before and immediately after the war facilitated later campaigns for official recognition, language revitalization, and cultural protection. Archival correspondence demonstrates continuity in leadership, priorities, and organizational strategies, emphasizing a sustained commitment to both identity preservation and socio-political engagement. A third interpretive insight. Early organizational activity illustrates the proactive agency of Ainu communities, countering narratives that depict assimilation as complete or uncontested. By late century, political change accelerated. Modern legal recognition began not through legislation, but through a court case. The 1997 Nibutani Dam case represented a watershed moment in Ainu legal and political history. Local Ainu residents of Nibutani in southern Hokkaido challenged the construction of a dam on the Saru River, arguing that the project would destroy sacred sites and infringe upon their cultural and property rights. The legal proceedings relied on detailed anthropological and historical evidence documenting continuous Ainu presence, ritual practice, and customary land use. The Sapporo District Court ultimately recognized that the Ainu constituted an indigenous people with historical ties to the land, marking the first formal acknowledgement of their status within Japanese legal discourse. The court's decision was grounded in meticulous analysis of historical continuity, demonstrating that the Ainu had maintained distinct cultural, social, and religious practices despite centuries of assimilationist policies. Expert testimony cited archaeological findings, linguistic studies, and ethnographic documentation to support claims of unbroken occupation and culturally specific land use. Government records and environmental assessments further reinforced the uniqueness of the Saru River Valley to Ainu ritual and subsistence activity. Interpretive insight. The Nibutani case illustrates how historical and anthropological scholarship can directly inform contemporary legal outcomes, bridging research and rights advocacy. Legal reasoning in the case emphasized the infringement on both tangible and intangible cultural heritage. Sacred sites, fishing grounds, and traditional pathways were treated as legally relevant interests, signaling a recognition of indigenous connection to land beyond formal property titles. While the court did not halt the dam's construction, it established a precedent acknowledging the legitimacy of Ainu cultural claims and the necessity of consultation in future development projects. This represented a significant shift from prior legal frameworks, which largely ignored or marginalized Ainu rights. The broader implications of the ruling extended into policy discourse. National and prefectural authorities began reassessing laws and administrative practices affecting Ainu communities, including land management, cultural preservation, and educational support. Subsequent governmental initiatives cited the Nibutani decision as justification for measures promoting recognition, protection, and revitalization. A second interpretive insight. The case underscores how judicial acknowledgement can catalyze broader policy reform, even in the absence of immediate legislative action. The decision also strengthened Ainu advocacy networks. Organizations documented historical evidence, coordinated legal strategies, and engaged media to raise awareness. Collaboration between scholars, lawyers, and community leaders enhanced both the evidentiary rigor and public legitimacy of claims. This period illustrates the synergy between historical scholarship and political activism, demonstrating how empirical research informs indigenous rights campaigns. A third interpretive insight. Legal recognition was both a product of historical documentation and a mechanism reinforcing cultural preservation. By formally acknowledging the Ainu as an indigenous people, the 1997 Nibutani Dam decision established a critical legal foundation for subsequent policy initiatives. It reframed the relationship between state authorities and Ainu communities, signaling that cultural heritage, land rights, and historical continuity must be considered in governance and development planning. Legal recognition paved the way for national policy changes. After decades of activism, formal national recognition finally arrived. In 2008, the Japanese Diet passed a resolution formally recognizing the Ainu as an indigenous people, building on decades of legal, scholarly, and community advocacy. The resolution acknowledged historical injustices, including forced assimilation and land dispossession, and committed the state to promoting Ainu culture, language, and social development. Parliamentary records detail the extensive consultations that preceded the resolution, involving local Ainu organizations, scholars, and representatives from Hokkaido prefectural authorities. This act marked a definitive shift in national policy, moving from passive acknowledgement to active support for Ainu communities. Subsequent policy developments culminated in the 2019 Ainu Policy Promotion Act, Ainu Saisaku Suishin Ho, which established a comprehensive legal framework for cultural revitalization, education, and economic development. The legislation created mechanisms for supporting Ainu language instruction, preserving cultural sites, and promoting traditional crafts and performing arts. Government reports indicate the establishment of advisory councils and collaboration with local associations to ensure that policy decisions reflected community needs. Interpretive insight. The 2019 Act represents both a symbolic and practical affirmation of Ainu identity, codifying protections and support previously addressed only informally or locally. The policy framework also enabled the development of cultural institutions. Museums, research centers, and cultural parks, such as the National Ainu Museum and Upapoi National Ainu Cultural Center, were established to serve as hubs for education, heritage preservation, and public engagement. These institutions document the historical trajectory of Ainu society, from Jōmon roots through contemporary activism, using archaeological, ethnographic, and oral history resources. Records show significant investment in exhibitions, language programs, and community workshops designed to facilitate intergenerational knowledge transfer. A second interpretive insight: institutional support has been central to consolidating recognition and fostering sustainable cultural transmission. Economic and social support measures accompanied cultural initiatives. Grants and subsidies for traditional crafts, fishing cooperatives, and small-scale enterprise were introduced, alongside vocational training programs to enhance participation in broader economic systems. Government evaluations indicate that these measures, while limited in scope, contributed to stabilizing certain communities and enhancing visibility of Ainu heritage within regional and national contexts. Documentation of these programs reflects a deliberate strategy to link cultural preservation with socio-economic development, reinforcing identity and community cohesion. The resolution and subsequent legislation also provided a framework for addressing historical injustices. Initiatives included recognition of past discrimination, efforts to repatriate or protect cultural artifacts, and consultation mechanisms for land and resource management. Scholarly assessments highlight that these policies were informed by extensive research into historical grievances, illustrating a continued interplay between historical documentation and policy implementation. A third interpretive insight: contemporary legislation reflects an integrated approach combining cultural, economic, and historical considerations to support indigenous rights and identity. By 2019, national policy had transitioned from acknowledgement to structured action, embedding Ainu recognition within legal, cultural, and administrative systems. These reforms formalize state responsibility for supporting Ainu society, establishing mechanisms for cultural preservation, education, and economic participation. The combined effect of legal recognition, policy development, and institutional support created a foundation for sustained cultural revitalization across Hokkaido and associated regions. With recognition established, cultural revitalization expanded. Cultural revitalization efforts have reconnected Ainu communities with heritage once threatened by erasure. In the 21st century, Ainu cultural revitalization has taken on multiple institutional and community-driven forms. Language programs have been central, with schools and community centers offering classes in Ainu language, supplemented by digital resources and curricula developed in collaboration with linguists. These initiatives draw on historical documentation, such as Pilsudski's recordings and early ethnographic studies, to reconstruct dialects and promote consistent instruction. Participation has expanded across age groups, reflecting both local engagement and broader interest in preserving linguistic heritage. Craft and material culture preservation has also been emphasized. Traditional practices, including embroidery, woodcarving, and ceremonial object production, are taught through workshops, apprenticeships, and cultural festivals. Museums and cultural centers, notably the National Ainu Museum and Upapoi Cultural Center, provide both educational programming and exhibition spaces, ensuring artifacts and knowledge are accessible to the public while maintaining community oversight. Records indicate that these institutions collaborate with Ainu artisans to authenticate methods and maintain traditional standards. Community programs extend beyond education and crafts. Ritual and seasonal practices, including bear ceremonies and seasonal festivals, are now performed in ways that respect both historical protocols and contemporary legal and social frameworks. Documentation from cultural committees shows careful balancing of authenticity with accessibility, fostering intergenerational transmission while accommodating modern conditions. Interpretive insight: these programs demonstrate a pragmatic approach, integrating historical knowledge, community priorities, and institutional support. Additionally, collaboration with academic and governmental bodies has reinforced revitalization efforts. Funding, research partnerships, and policy guidance help sustain long-term programming, linking cultural preservation to broader social recognition. Linguistic documentation, archival research, and material culture studies continue to inform revitalization strategies, illustrating the ongoing relevance of historical scholarship in contemporary cultural policy. A second interpretive insight: revitalization is both a recovery and an active adaptation, demonstrating how historical continuity can coexist with modern institutional frameworks. Through these initiatives, Ainu communities have strengthened cultural identity, restored visibility within national discourse, and created mechanisms for the transmission of knowledge. This multifaceted approach ensures that language, craft, and ritual are not merely preserved as museum artifacts, but actively practiced and integrated into community life. To conclude, the documentary evaluates Ainu history's long-term legacy. Modern research continues to refine understanding of Ainu history. Scholarly inquiry into Ainu origins and cultural development has evolved significantly over the past century, reflecting advances in archaeology, genetics, and historiography. Early interpretations emphasized continuity from Jōmon populations, often using cranial morphology, dental traits, and material culture comparisons to trace ancestry. Excavations of northern Hokkaido and Sakhalin sites, including pit dwellings, pottery assemblages, and subsistence remains, have provided increasingly nuanced perspectives on regional variation and adaptation. Archaeological studies indicate that northern Jōmon, Sakhalin, and Okkotsk cultural traits persisted alongside incoming influences, demonstrating a complex process of ethnogenesis rather than linear cultural replacement. Interpretive insight. Archaeological evidence supports a model of layered cultural continuity, highlighting the Ainu as inheritors of multiple interacting traditions. Genetic studies have complemented material research. Analyses of mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome markers, and autosomal variation suggest a distinct Ainu genetic profile, reflecting admixture between Jōmon-descended populations and subsequent northern migrants, including Okkotsk-related groups. Comparative genomic studies indicate that Ainu populations retain features differentiating them from both modern Japanese and neighboring Siberian populations. These findings reinforce historical and archaeological narratives of long-term regional continuity combined with external influence. A second interpretive insight. Genetic evidence confirms the Ainu as a population with deep roots in northern Japan, while also documenting dynamic interregional contact over millennia. Historiographical debates continue regarding the interpretation of material culture, language, and ritual practices. Scholars discuss the extent to which Sakhalin and Okkotsk traits were maintained versus transformed in response to external pressures, including Wajin expansion and later Tokugawa-era subjugation. Analysis of bare ceremonial artifacts, iron tool distribution, and settlement organization offers insights into social structure and belief systems, while linguistic studies of Ainu place names, syntax, and vocabulary contribute to understanding cultural resilience. Interpretive insight. Interdisciplinary scholarship demonstrates that Ainu history cannot be reduced to a single narrative of assimilation or survival, but instead reflects ongoing negotiation of identity and practice. Technological advances in archaeology, including isotopic dietary analysis, radiocarbon dating, and GIS mapping, have refined chronologies and clarified patterns of mobility, trade, and resource use. Excavations at key northern sites reveal evidence of maritime specialization, inland agriculture, and seasonal migration, allowing researchers to trace the mechanisms through which cultural knowledge and subsistence strategies persisted. These advances also facilitate comparisons between Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands, highlighting regional diversity within the broader Ainu cultural sphere. A third interpretive insight. Methodological innovations enhance our ability to contextualize Ainu adaptations within environmental, economic, and political frameworks. Ongoing debates address the implications of historical interpretation for contemporary policy and cultural identity. Recognition of Ainu as an indigenous people has encouraged re-examination of archival sources, oral histories, and archaeological findings, prompting scholars to integrate community perspectives alongside empirical data. Collaborative research between Ainu organizations and academic institutions exemplifies a model in which historiography directly informs social and cultural revitalization. The Ainu experience also offers comparative insights. The Ainu story parallels indigenous experiences across the world. Ainu history illustrates broader patterns seen among indigenous populations navigating state expansion, colonization, and cultural suppression. Like Native American, Sami, and Australian Aboriginal communities, the Ainu faced policies of land dispossession, assimilation, and marginalization under a dominant settler or state society. Comparative analysis shows recurring dynamics: encroachment on traditional territories, imposition of foreign legal systems, and efforts to replace indigenous languages and social structures with those of the dominant population. Archival records and ethnographic studies indicate that, despite these pressures, Ainu communities maintained core cultural practices, reflecting resilience shared by many indigenous groups globally. Economic integration and trade provide another point of comparison. In the same way that Native Americans and Arctic indigenous populations engaged with European settlers to varying degrees, Ainu communities actively participated in regional trade networks with Wajan merchants, Russian traders, and neighboring northern peoples. Historical evidence shows that trade could serve both as a means of survival and as a vector for external influence, shaping social organization, settlement patterns, and technological adoption. Interpretive insight. The Ainu experience demonstrates how indigenous groups negotiate agency within asymmetrical economic relationships, balancing adaptation with cultural continuity. Legal recognition and cultural revitalization also mirror global indigenous movements. Landmark court cases, parliamentary resolutions, and contemporary policy initiatives parallel efforts in countries such as Canada, New Zealand, and Norway, where indigenous rights, land claims, and language revitalization have become central to state-indigenous relations. Documentation of Ainu legal struggles, including the 1997 Nibutani Dam decision, provides a clear example of how historical evidence, ethnography, and community advocacy intersect to influence policy. A second interpretive insight: legal and institutional mechanisms can provide tangible frameworks for cultural survival, though they often require decades of sustained activism. Cultural preservation efforts among the Ainu, language programs, craft revitalization, ritual maintenance, align with global patterns of indigenous self-determination. Collaboration with academic institutions and government bodies has facilitated documentation, education, and dissemination, echoing similar strategies employed by indigenous groups worldwide to protect and transmit cultural knowledge. These initiatives underscore the importance of combining grassroots engagement with structural support, highlighting the interdependence of community agency and institutional recognition. A third interpretive insight: the Ainu case illustrates that cultural resilience is both adaptive and strategic, involving negotiation between internal priorities and external pressures. By situating the Ainu experience within a comparative indigenous framework, it becomes evident that their history is not isolated, but part of a wider pattern of survival, adaptation, and advocacy. Recognition, legal reform, and cultural revitalization in Japan reflect both unique historical circumstances and universal challenges faced by indigenous peoples globally. The documentary ends with an assessment of long-term impact. The Ainu legacy remains integral to understanding Northern East Asia. Ainu history has left enduring marks on Japan's cultural, social, and academic landscapes. Archaeological and ethnographic research demonstrates that Ainu communities preserved unique lifeways, technologies, and ritual practices that contributed to the broader understanding of Japan's prehistoric and medieval development. From Jōmon continuity in material culture to maritime and inland adaptations during the Satsuma and Okhotsk periods, the Ainu provide a vital perspective on northern Japanese history. Interpretive insight: their long-term presence highlights regional diversity within the archipelago, illustrating how peripheral societies shaped ecological, economic, and cultural networks. Beyond Japan, the Ainu are central to circumpolar studies, linking Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands to broader northern Asia. Comparative analysis of subsistence strategies, maritime economies, and settlement organization informs understanding of human adaptation to subarctic and temperate environments. Archaeological and genetic research demonstrates connections with Okhotsk, Nifk, and other northern peoples, offering evidence of trade, migration, and cultural exchange. A second interpretive insight: studying the Ainu contributes to global models of human resilience in marginal environments and cross-cultural interaction in the circumpolar region. Cultural and linguistic contributions also underscore their significance. Preservation of the Ainu language, traditional crafts, and ritual practices enriches Japan's cultural diversity and provides insight into indigenous epistemologies and cosmologies. Museums, cultural centers, and revitalization programs highlight continuity and innovation, allowing historical knowledge to inform contemporary identity and policy. These initiatives also serve as a model for integrating scholarly research with community-led cultural preservation. A third interpretive insight: the Ainu exemplify how minority cultures can retain identity and agency despite centuries of political and social marginalization. The Ainu legacy therefore operates on multiple levels: historical, anthropological, and socio-political. Their experiences illustrate processes of ethnogenesis, adaptation, and resilience, while contributing to broader understanding of human-environment interaction, indigenous state relations, and cultural diversity. By documenting and preserving these histories, scholars, policymakers, and communities together ensure that the Ainu remain a vital part of Japan's past and present, offering lessons for both regional and global contexts. Thank you for exploring the rich history and enduring legacy of the Ainu with us. To continue uncovering the stories of civilizations and cultures around the world, subscribe to our channel and stay connected with carefully researched, chronologically precise historical documentaries. For those who want to dive deeper, check the description for recommended readings, sources, and further resources on the Ainu and Northern Japan. Stay curious, and join us in bringing the past into the present.